The fire is already burning. That is the first thing. Before the dogs have settled, before the last of the torches along the upper wall have guttered down to their sockets, before the rushes on the floor have stopped shifting under the feet of the people who have been crossing them all evening, the fire is burning. It has been burning since before dawn. It will be burning still when dawn comes again. At the centre of the great hall, in a hearth wide enough to park a carriage, the fire does what fires in great halls have always done. It breathes, it shifts, it throws light that moves the shadows of every rafter and every hanging and every person in the room, so that nothing in a firelit hall ever quite holds still. You notice this if you have been sitting near it long enough. The world flickers. Everything is alive in a firelit room in a way that nothing is alive under electric light, because the fire itself is alive, genuinely, biologically, chemically alive, and the light it throws carries that aliveness with it into every corner. It is deep winter. Outside the walls of this hall, outside the thick stone that has been absorbing cold for months and giving it back slowly through the night, England is dark and frozen and extraordinarily quiet. The village that belongs to this estate has gone to sleep. The fields that surround it are iron hard. The track that leads from the village to the gatehouse is mud frozen into ridges that would turn an ankle if you walked it without thinking. There are stars tonight, because the clouds that brought the last snow 3 days ago have finally pulled back, and the sky above the hall is clear and bitter and absolutely full of light that cannot warm anything. That light does not reach inside. Inside, the fire reaches everything. If you have never spent an evening in a hall like this one, I want to try to place you here properly. Not in the way that history books place you, with architecture and dates and the names of lords. In the way that your body would experience it, if your body were sitting in the rushes on the great stone floor, leaning back against the base of one of the trestle tables that have not yet been folded away for the night. You would feel the heat of the fire on the front of your face, and the cold of the stone floor coming up through your clothes at the back. That is the first thing your body would tell you. This place is divided. There is warmth on one side and cold on the other, and where you are is the seam between them, and the fire is everything. If you're settling in right now, if the lights are low where you are, if the blanket is pulled up, if the world outside has gone quiet in the way it does late at night, when most of the people in it are finally sleeping, then you are already closer to this place than you might think. Stay there. Stay in that warmth. Let the fire do what fires do. We are going in. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this one, subscribe. I post stories like this every week. I want to start with the smell, because the smell of a medieval great hall in winter is one of those things that no amount of historical reading quite prepares you for, and once you understand what it was made of, it changes the way you picture everything else that happened inside it. The first layer is smoke, not the clean romantic wood smoke of a camping fire or a backyard fire pit, but the deep settled, months accumulated, soaked into every surface smoke of a hall that has had a fire burning in its centre for decades. Stone absorbs smoke, timber absorbs smoke. The rushes on the floor, the tapestries on the walls, the woolen clothing of every person in the room, the dogs sleeping near the hearth, the straw in the sleeping pallets rolled against the lower wall, all of it has absorbed smoke for years, and all of it is giving that smoke back to the air a little at a time, all day and all night, in a slow, continuous exhalation that is simply the background smell of the world. Medieval people did not notice this the way a visitor would notice it. It was not a smell to them. It was simply the smell of being inside, the smell of shelter, the smell of warmth. The word home, if medieval English had given it a scent, would have smelled like that. Below the smoke, underneath it and woven through it, is the smell of the rushes. Rushes were the floor covering of the medieval hall, cut from the riverbank in summer, dried, and laid down in a layer thick enough to provide some insulation against the cold of the stone beneath. In a well-managed household, the rushes were changed regularly, maybe once a month, maybe more often in the summer when they fouled faster, and sweet-smelling herbs were mixed into them. Meadowsweet, lavender, pennyroyal, tansy. Strewing herbs they were called, and the practice of scattering them through the floor covering was so universal that it made it into the household management literature of the period. Dame Juliana Berners, writing in the 15th century, described the ideal household floor as decked with green and smelling of summer even in winter. That was the aspiration. The reality, in the deepest part of winter, in a hall that had been occupied continuously since October, was somewhat earthier. The rushes in a great hall in February smelled of everything that had happened in them since October. They smelled of spilled ale and spilled broth and the grease from 100 shared meals, and the feet of dogs, and the feet of people, and the occasional discreet corner used by a child who could not quite make it outside in time, and underneath all of it, still faintly present if you pushed your hand down to the bottom layer, the ghost of meadow sweet from when they were first laid down. The historian Erasmus, visiting England in the early 16th century, had opinions about this. He wrote to a physician friend that the floors of English houses were covered with rushes, occasionally renewed, but so imperfectly that the bottom layer is left undisturbed sometimes for 20 years, harbouring expectoration, vomiting, the leakage of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and other abominations not fit to be mentioned. Erasmus was not a man who kept his opinions to himself. He was also, it must be said, probably describing a lesser household than the one we are sitting in tonight. The rushes in a great lord's hall were changed more regularly than those of a minor manor. But the general principle he was getting at was real. The floor of a medieval hall was a living record of everything that had happened on it. And then there were the dogs. I want to spend a moment on the dogs because they are so central to the sensory reality of a medieval great hall that leaving them out would be like leaving the fire out. There were always dogs in a great hall. Not one or two household pets in the modern sense, kept in particular rooms, fed particular food, treated as something between a companion and an ornament. There were packs. A prosperous noble household in medieval England might keep between 15 and 30 dogs, depending on the season and the lord's enthusiasm for hunting. And in winter, when the hunting was limited and the dogs were not working, they lived inside. They slept near the fire. They moved between the tables at mealtimes looking for what fell or could be encouraged to fall. They occupied the floor space around the hearth in a shifting, breathing, occasionally snarling arrangement of bodies that was one of the primary sources of warmth in the room for anyone willing to be near them. The breeds kept in great halls were not modern breeds in any exact sense, but their functions were recognisable. Large hunting dogs called allaunts, heavy-bodied and smooth-coated, bred for bringing down large game. Greyhounds, already ancient in their lineage and already associated specifically with noble status, lean and extraordinarily fast and surprisingly gentle when they were not working. Smaller dogs called spaniels, used for flushing birds from cover, their coats perpetually tangled with whatever they had last run through. Terriers of various kinds for keeping the rats in check, a job that was never finished. In a great hall in winter, all of these dogs were present, variously groomed and variably odorous, adding their own considerable contribution to the layered smell of the room. There is a record from the household of Edward IV, a set of ordinances governing the management of the royal household, called the Black Book, compiled around 1472, that specifically addresses the problem of dogs in the hall. It specifies that no one below the rank of esquire should keep hounds or other such great dogs in the hall, and it expresses particular concern about the behaviour of dogs during meals. Dogs were not to be fed at the table. Dogs were not to be permitted to jump onto the tables. These rules appear in the household management documents because they needed to be written down, which tells you something about what was happening before they were written down. The dogs are sleeping now, most of them. It is late in the evening. The last meal of the day was hours ago, and the dogs have settled into their various arrangements near the hearth, breathing slowly in the warmth. A large allaunce is stretched full length against the stone of the hearth surround, its heavy paws twitching occasionally in some dream of pursuit. 2 greyhounds are curled together in a single tight circle near the base of the central pillar, their thin-skinned sides rising and falling in a rhythm so slow and steady it is almost hypnotic to watch. If you have been near sleeping dogs, you know this rhythm. There is something in it that makes your own body want to match it, your own breath slow to keep pace, your own eyes grow heavy in sympathy. The hall itself, the physical space of it, is larger than you might expect if your only experience of medieval buildings comes from films or paintings. The great halls of major English noble households range from roughly 60 feet in length to over 100, and in width from perhaps 30 feet to 50 or more. The Hall of Penshurst Place in Kent, one of the best preserved examples in England, is 62 feet long and 39 feet wide, with a roof that soars to 50 feet at its peak. Westminster Hall, the Great Hall of the Royal Palace, was 240 feet long and nearly 70 feet wide, the largest secular medieval building in Northern Europe. The one we are in tonight is somewhere between these extremes. It is large enough that the far end of the hall, where the screen's passage and the entrance door are, is in genuine shadow at this hour, the firelight not reaching that far, the cold from the uninsulated stone walls pressing more insistently the further you get from the hearth. The roof is timber. This is important because the timber roof of a great hall is one of the most extraordinary things about it, and in the firelight it becomes something close to spectacular. The great English timber roofs of the medieval period, the hammer-beam roofs and crown-post roofs and arch-braced collar roofs that survive in places like Westminster and Eltham, and the Guildhall, were engineering achievements of a kind that still impresses structural engineers today. They span enormous widths without any interior support columns, using a geometry of interlocking timbers that distributes the weight of the roof outward and downward in a way that leaves the floor of the hall entirely clear. The timber was oak. The oak in a great hall roof was typically old growth, dense and slow-seasoned, dark with age, and it has been absorbing smoke and firelight for so long that in many surviving examples the timber is almost black, so dark and polished-looking that it seems to be made of something other than wood. In firelight, a hammer-beam roof is alive. The shadows move with the fire. The carved figures at the ends of the hammer beams, the angels and grotesques and heraldic animals that the best carpenters put there, catch the light from below and change expression as the flames shift. They look different at different times of night. In the early evening, with the fire at its height, and the torches still burning along the walls, the roof is full of warm orange light, and the carved figures have a golden look, serene and solid. Later, when the torches have guttered out one by one and only the fire remains, the light is lower and redder, and the shadows are deeper, and the carved faces look different. Not frightening exactly. Something older than frightening. Something that was there before the hall was built and will still be there after it is gone. The walls below the roof are dressed stone on the lower sections and plaster above, the plaster lime-washed white and in the better households painted with decorative schemes in deep red and blue and green. You can see the paint in the firelight, or the suggestion of it, the colours darker and richer than they were in daylight, the patterns of the painted borders and the heraldic devices and the biblical scenes that run along the upper walls, visible in the moving light the way things are visible in dreams. There are tapestries on the longest walls, the north wall and the south wall, heavy wool panels that serve two purposes simultaneously. They are decoration, displaying the heraldic colours and emblematic imagery of the Lord's lineage, and they are insulation, their heavy wool blocking the cold that otherwise pours off the stone walls like invisible water. They move slightly in the draughts that come through gaps in the stonework and around the edges of the shuttered windows, a slow, continuous shifting that makes the hunting scenes and religious subjects they depict seem very slightly, almost imperceptibly, animate. The windows are shuttered now. In the daytime, the hall receives light through a series of tall, narrow windows set high in the walls, their stone tracery designed as much for structural elegance as for utility. The glass in those windows where glass is used is not the clear glass we know. Medieval window glass was greenish or yellowish, full of tiny bubbles and slight distortions, and it admitted a peculiar underwater quality of light that medieval painters tried to replicate in their work and never quite succeeded. At night, the wooden shutters close over the windows from inside, and the hall becomes entirely enclosed, entirely self-contained, its weather made by the fire alone. The floor between the fire and the far wall is slightly lower than the floor at the high end of the hall, where the Lord's table stood on its dais. This is the lower hall, the main body of the room, and it is here that the household has spent the evening and will spend the night. The trestle tables that were used for supper are still set up, the boards balanced on their crossed wooden supports, though the tablecloths have been removed and the plates and cups gathered. They will be folded against the wall before everyone sleeps, making room for the sleeping pallets, but that has not happened yet. The evening is still technically in progress, though it is winding down, the way evenings in places like this always wind down, not with a defined ending, but with a gradual diminuendo, a slow quieting that starts at the edges and works its way inward. The high table at the far end of the hall on the dais is empty now. The Lord and Lady have retired to their private chambers, the solar above and behind the hall, taking with them a small retinue of personal servants, the ladies' women, the lord's squire, a page or two. The great hall in the hours after their departure belongs to the household, to the servants and the minor officials and the visiting dependents and the dogs, and it takes on a different quality when the lord is gone, not a worse quality, a looser one. The posture of the room changes, the degree of watchfulness required decreases, voices that were careful become ordinary, laughter that was contained becomes real. There is something I want you to hold on to as we move through this evening together. The medieval Great Hall was not a background. It was not a stage set for the drama of lordly life, a passive container for the people who used it. The hall was a living technology, a machine for making community and demonstrating power and surviving winter and feeding people and providing shelter and maintaining a particular kind of social order that knitted very different kinds of people together in a single space. It was doing all of those things simultaneously, all the time, every day, through every season. Understanding what the hall was actually doing, beneath the surfaces of stone and timber and firelight, is what this evening is about. We have time, the fire is burning, there is nowhere to go. The smell of the rushes and the warmth of the fire and the slow breathing of the dogs and the faint movement of the tapestries in the draughts from the walls. This is where we are. Let us stay here a while. Here is a fact that I want you to sit with, because when I first came across it, I had to stop and reread it several times to make sure I was understanding it correctly. The central hearth of a great medieval hall, the open fire burning on the flat stone in the middle of the floor, with no chimney above it and only a louvre, a vent in the roof ridge to carry the smoke out, was not a failure of architectural imagination. It was not a primitive stage in the development toward the wall fireplace and the chimney. For a substantial period of the medieval era, in the halls of the wealthiest, most sophisticated, most architecturally ambitious households in England, the central hearth was the preferred form. It was chosen, and the reasons it was chosen tell you something fundamental about what a fire in a great hall was actually for. A wall fireplace draws its smoke up a flue and out through a chimney. It is efficient in a certain narrow sense. It removes the smoke from the room. But it also does something else. It directs all the heat produced by the fire upward, out of the chimney, away from the room. A wall fireplace in a large hall heats the wall immediately surrounding it, and a modest radius of floor space in front of it. The rest of the hall remains cold. Medieval builders understood this perfectly well. A central hearth, burning in the open air of the middle of the room, radiates heat in every direction simultaneously. The smoke rises to the roof, and out through the louvre. Yes, filling the upper reaches of the hall with a haze that settles into the rafters and the timber and eventually into everything. But the heat spreads outward in all directions, reaching all of the floor space, touching all of the people sitting or standing or lying in a ring around it. In a hall with 100 people in it, on a night in February when the stone walls are cold enough to condensate, the central hearth was not simply warmth. It was survival. It was the difference between a room that was livable and a room that was not. The wall fireplace came later, in the 14th and 15th centuries, spreading from France and becoming more common in England as architectural fashion shifted, and as the social function of the hall began to change, as lords began withdrawing more often from the communal space to private chambers, as the hall became less a place where the entire household lived together, and more a ceremonial space used for formal occasions. As the hall became less communal, it could afford a less efficient hearth. But in the great age of the hall, in the 11th and 12th and early 13th centuries, the fire in the centre was the fire that kept everyone alive. I want to tell you about the Louvre. Not many people who think about medieval architecture have spent time thinking about the Louvre, and it is worth thinking about because it is one of the most elegant pieces of medieval environmental engineering that exists. So elegant and so simple that you can feel slightly embarrassed on behalf of later generations who thought the solution to smoke was merely to put the fire against the wall. The Louvre sat at the ridge of the roof directly above the central hearth. In its simplest form, it was an opening in the roof, protected from rain by a small lantern-like wooden or stone structure, often louvred, meaning fitted with angled boards like the shutters of a window, which allowed air to exit but prevented rain from entering directly. In more sophisticated forms, the Louvre was a small architectural feature in its own right, sometimes quite elaborate, sometimes topped with a weather vane, the smoke curling out around its edges and the wind carrying it away. When the wind changed direction, the louvre could be adjusted. There are records of louvres being turned by hand or by rope from below, rotating to keep the opening facing downwind and drawing the smoke out rather than letting it be pushed back in. A fire with a good louvre above it in the right conditions drew almost as cleanly as a modern chimney. The smoke rose, the louvre carried it out, and what remained in the room was warmth and light. What remained in the room when the wind was wrong, or the louvre was not adjusted quickly enough, or the wood was damp, or the day was still and the draw was poor, was considerably more smoke. Living with variable amounts of smoke was simply part of being inside in the medieval period. Everyone understood this. Everyone had strategies for managing it. You sat below the smoke line, because the smoke gathered in the upper reaches of the hall, and the lower air was cleaner. You kept your face turned away from the fire when the smoke blew your direction. You had learned, from childhood, to notice the particular change in the fire that meant the draw was about to shift, the way the flames bent and the smoke curled down instead of up, and you moved before it reached you. The fuel for this fire is oak. I want to tell you about the oak because the oak is doing something tonight that is worth understanding. The oak logs burning in this hearth were cut last winter, or the winter before, because oak needs to season for at least a year before it burns well, and in a well-managed estate the wood cutting is planned years in advance. The woodland that belongs to this estate, managed by coppicing and pollarding, is a resource calculated as carefully as the grain store or the salt barrel. You cut a certain number of trees each year, you leave the rest. The coppiced stumps send up new growth that will be ready in 7 to 15 years. The system is sustainable because it has to be. There is no alternative fuel source. The fire is oak because oak was available, and oak was available because someone was managing the woodland with a long view, which means someone was making plans they would not live to see completed, which is a form of trust in the future that I find genuinely moving. An oak fire burns differently from other fires. It burns hotter, longer, and more steadily than softwood. The flame is less dramatic, less given to the leaping and crackling theatrics of pine or spruce, but the heat is more substantial, more reliable, more present in the body-warming sense that matters in a cold hall. An oak fire at its full strength puts out a heat that you feel on your face at 10 feet, that you feel in your chest at 5, that you feel on your hands and arms even with your back to it. The coals that an oak fire produces are dense and long-lived. A properly banked oak fire can hold a living coal for 8 to 12 hours under the right conditions, which is why the art of banking, of burying the live coal under ash before sleep, was the most important skill possessed by anyone responsible for fire in a hall like this. The fire right now, in this middle of the winter evening, is at a stage that fire people would call a good working fire. It is not at its peak, which was earlier in the day, when the cook fires in the kitchens were also blazing, and the hall fire was maintained at full height, for the warmth of the Lord's household during the day's activities. It is past its peak, but nowhere near its end. The big logs at the back are well established, burning slowly with a deep red and orange intensity, and there are fresher logs on the front that have caught but are still flaming, still in the theatrical part of their burning, still making the kind of fire that draws the eye. Between the deep red of the established coals and the dancing yellow and orange of the newer wood, the fire does what fire always does in this state. It creates a depth, a sense of looking into something that extends further than it actually does, a sense that there is more world behind the flames than physics would suggest. The light this fire throws is not steady. I want to be precise about this because the unsteadiness of firelight is one of the most important things about it, and it is something we have lost so completely that it requires active imagination to reconstruct. We live under steady electric light. Our lights do not breathe. They do not pulse with the movement of air or the settling of fuel. They do not throw shadows that shift. The walls of a room in electric light are fixed. The ceiling is fixed. The faces of the people in the room are fixed, illuminated evenly and consistently, every feature present and accounted for. In firelight, nothing is fixed. Everything moves. The shadows in this hall are alive. The shadow of a rafter moves when the fire shifts. The shadow of a person sitting still moves because the fire moves. The painted scenes on the upper walls seem to be in motion, the horses in the hunting scene seeming to run, the figures in the religious panel seeming to gesture. The faces of the carved angels in the hammer-beam roof catch the light from below at angles that change moment to moment, so that they seem to breathe, to watch, to turn slightly toward the warmth. This is not superstition and it is not imagination. This is physics. The firelight is genuinely moving. Everything in its range is genuinely moving in response. For the people sitting in this hall tonight, this is simply the way the world looks after dark. This is normal. The movement of firelight shadows is as unremarkable to them as the steadiness of electric light is to us. But there is something happening in that movement, something that the research literature on firelight and circadian rhythms is beginning to articulate, which is that the human nervous system responds differently to firelight than to other kinds of light. A study by anthropologist Christopher Lynn at the University of Alabama, published in 2014, measured the blood pressure of subjects exposed to video recordings of fire, some with sound and some without. The subjects watching fire showed measurable decreases in blood pressure. The effect was stronger with sound. The longer they watched, the calmer they became. Lynn described the response as consistent with what he called a relaxation response, a downregulation of the nervous system that seems to be deeply connected to fire in a way that other stimuli do not produce. He suggested that this response may have evolutionary origins, that the human nervous system may be genuinely calibrated to relax in the presence of fire in a way that was adaptive for a species that spent hundreds of thousands of years gathering around fires in the dark. The people sitting in this hall tonight are not thinking about evolutionary psychology, but their bodies are doing what Lynn's subjects' bodies did. The blood pressure is dropping, the shoulders are dropping, the eyes, which have been busy and alert all day, are finding the fire and staying there, watching the movement of flame with a quality of attention that is not quite concentration and not quite rest, but somewhere between the two. The particular mental state that firelight seems to produce in human beings reliably across all periods and cultures, the state of being awake but not urgent, present but not active, quietly alive in the warmth. Let me tell you who is in this hall tonight. There is the steward of the household, who sits at the end of the nearest trestle table. He's a man of middle age, perhaps 50, perhaps a few years either side of it, his face weathered and his hands large, and his expression one of permanent mild calculation. The steward runs the day-to-day operation of the household. He is responsible for the finances, the provisioning, the management of the servants, the keeping of accounts, the correspondence with tenants and suppliers, and the Lord's various agents. He has been awake since well before dawn, and will be awake again before dawn tomorrow, because the work of a medieval estate steward is genuinely never finished, only paused. Right now he is not calculating anything. He is looking at the fire with the same look the dogs have, the deep, settled look of a creature that has done its day's work and is allowing its body to notice. He is drinking a cup of ale slowly. He will drink one more before he sleeps. There is a group of young men near the far side of the fire. They are the younger members of the household, 2 pages, boys of perhaps 12 and 14, who are in service here as part of their education in the expectations and customs of noble household management, a squire of perhaps 17, already long-limbed and broad in the shoulder, who has been in this household for 3 years, and will be knighted within a few years if everything goes as expected. They are talking in the low, rapid way of young men whose conversation has been constrained by the formalities of the evening, and who now have a little latitude. One of the pages is laughing at something, a breathless, suppressed laugh that he is trying to keep quiet, which is making it louder. The squire is watching the page with the particular expression of an older person, who finds younger people's amusement mildly embarrassing and secretly infectious. The other page is not quite smiling yet, but is clearly about to. There are women in the lower part of the hall, 2 kitchen workers who have been given leave to sit near the fire after the evening's work is done, both of them with the particular look of people who have been on their feet since before dawn, and are experiencing the sitting down in their entire bodies all at once, the way exhaustion transforms into something close to pleasure, when the thing that was causing it finally stops. One of them has removed her shoes and is holding her feet toward the fire with an expression of concentrated gratitude. The other is talking to her in a low voice, something that requires close attention and periodic nods, the conversation of people with a shared working life. There are perhaps 20 people in this hall right now. An hour ago there were more. 2 hours ago there were considerably more, when the evening meal was still being cleared and the household was in its full state of evening activity. As the evening has moved toward night, people have drifted away one by one and in small groups. Some have gone to sleeping places elsewhere. The servants with rooms above the kitchens or in the outbuildings, the senior household officials with their own chambers. What remains in the hall now is the subset of people for whom the hall itself is the sleeping place, whose pallets will be rolled out onto the rush-covered floor when the trestle tables are finally folded, who will sleep in the same room as the fire in the warmth that it provides under the shifting shadows of the roof. This is not a small number of people. Even at this hour there are perhaps 20 of them, and in another hour there will be others coming back from the kitchens and stables with the last tasks of the evening finished, and by the time everyone is settled, there will be 30 or more human bodies sleeping in this hall, arranged by rank and proximity to the fire in a pattern so consistent that it does not need to be negotiated. Everyone knows where they sleep. This is one of the things about the medieval Great Hall that I find most difficult to convey to a modern sensibility, which is accustomed to sleeping alone or in pairs in enclosed private spaces. The hall was communal, sleeping on a scale we have no real parallel for. 30 people in a room together, breathing each other's air, hearing each other's night sounds, near enough to touch, arranged by the logic of social rank around a single source of warmth. This was normal. This was not unusual in any way. This was Tuesday. This was... The first thing you would notice if you watched the arrangement of this hall at the end of the evening with a sociologist's eye rather than just the eyes of someone who lives in it, is that the distribution of people around the fire is not random. It follows a logic. That logic is so deeply understood by everyone in the room that it has never needed to be written down or explained or argued about. Everyone knows it the way they know which side of the road to walk on. It is simply the way things are. The people closest to the fire are the people of highest rank among those sleeping in the hall. The steward, who has the greatest authority of anyone remaining in the space, has the position closest to the fire. His pallet, when it is rolled out, will be nearer the hearth than any other. The squire is second. The pages are further out. The kitchen workers are near the wall. This is not a matter of discussion. It is a fact of the world. To understand why this mattered in physical terms, and not merely as a social convention, you need to understand something about what cold in a great hall in February actually feels like, and what the fire actually provides in terms of warmth at different distances from it. A medieval great hall was not warm in the sense that a modern heated room is warm. The fire was warm. The area within perhaps 15 or 20 feet of the fire was warm in the sense that you could be comfortable in it, in your ordinary winter clothing. Beyond that, the warmth decreased rapidly, because the stone walls and the stone floor and the enormous volume of cold air in the upper reaches of the hall were drawing heat away from the room faster than the fire could replace it at those distances. At the far end of the hall, near the screen's passage, on a night like this one, the temperature might be only a few degrees above freezing. The cold there was not theoretical. It was the specific bodily cold of fingers that do not quite work properly, and feet that have gone past numb into the particular dull ache of tissue that is losing heat faster than blood can supply it. The distribution of people around the fire was, in the most direct sense, the distribution of survival advantage. To sleep near the fire was to sleep warm. To sleep at the far end of the hall was to sleep cold enough that the cold itself might wake you in the night, might work its way through your wool blanket and your wool clothing into your skin and your joints, might be the reason you were still tired in the morning, even after a full night on your pallet, because the cold had been working against your rest all night. Everyone in this hall knew this. It was bodily knowledge, accumulated over every winter of their lives, and the allocation of proximity to the fire was the allocation of comfort, which was the allocation of health, which was ultimately the allocation of everything. The steward was not warm because he had earned it exactly, though the concept of earning a place in this world was certainly part of the worldview of everyone in it. He was warm because he was the steward, because the social order of the household was a real material force that manifested itself every night in the distance between his pallet and the fire. The historian Felicity Heal, writing about hospitality in early modern England, noted that the spatial logic of the Great Hall reproduced the social hierarchy of the household in physical form every single day. The high table on its dais, above the floor of the lower hall, the order in which people were served at meals from the highest to the lowest, the portions of food and drink that varied by rank, the places assigned for sleeping. The hall was not merely a building that contained a social hierarchy. It was a machine that expressed and reinforced that hierarchy at every moment of the day and night, through the most basic physical means available: food, warmth, rest. And yet, and I want to stay with this because it matters, the hall also contained something that the modern privatized domestic world, with its individual bedrooms and its carefully controlled personal spaces, does not contain in the same way. The hall contained everyone. The steward near the fire and the kitchen worker near the wall were in the same room. They breathed the same air. They heard the same sounds. They shared the same source of light. The social distance between them was enormous, structured by centuries of legal and cultural convention, but the physical distance was perhaps 30 feet. In a country house of the modern period, that kitchen worker would be in a different wing of the building, possibly a different building entirely. In the medieval Great Hall, they were together in the same warmth, the same smoke, the same company of sleeping dogs and settling embers, and the particular sounds of a large room containing human beings at rest. This is not a simple thing to evaluate. I want to resist making it into a false nostalgia for a lost communal world, because the kitchen worker near the wall was cold, and the steward near the fire was not cold, and that difference was real and material and unjust in any framework we might want to apply to it. But I also want to resist the equally easy opposite move, which is to see nothing in the arrangement except hierarchy and inequality, and to miss the thing that was genuinely present in the communal sleeping hall that is absent from our individual bedrooms, which is the simple, unambiguous, physical fact of being with other people in the dark. There is a body of research in sleep science suggesting that human beings, like many social mammals, sleep differently when they are with others than when they are alone. Matthew Walker, the neuroscientist whose work on sleep has been widely read in recent years, has noted that sleep in social groups appears to have been the ancestral norm for our species, and that the modern practice of solitary sleeping in completely dark, silent, individually enclosed spaces is a historical novelty of less than 2 centuries standing, concentrated in a relatively small number of high-income societies. The research on what this shift has done to human sleep quality and human psychological well-being is still developing, and the picture is not simple, but the direction of some of the findings is interesting. Social sleeping, sleeping in the presence of other trusted people, appears to offer something that solitary sleeping does not, specifically a degree of felt security, a reduction in the background vigilance that the nervous system maintains when it is alone in the dark. The people sleeping in this hall tonight are doing something that is probably quite good for their sleep, even though the floor is hard and the air is smoky, and the steward's position near the fire is significantly more comfortable than the kitchen worker's position near the wall. They are sleeping together. They are sleeping in the warmth of a fire. They are sleeping to the sound of other people breathing and dogs moving in their sleep, and the occasional shift of a log in the hearth. These are, from the perspective of the evolutionary history of human sleep, extremely familiar conditions. The nervous system recognizes them. Now let me tell you something about the timing of sleep in this hall, because it is one of the things about medieval daily life that surprises people most when they first encounter it. The people in this hall did not, as a rule, go to sleep when the evening activities ended and sleep through until morning without interruption. The consolidated 8-hour sleep that most modern people consider the natural and correct form of human sleep is, as the historian Roger E. Kirch has demonstrated in his book At Day's Close, published in 2005, a relatively recent development in the history of Western sleep. For most of recorded history in Europe and elsewhere, the typical adult sleep pattern was segmented. First sleep began at dark or shortly after, lasting for 4 or 5 hours. Then came a waking period of an hour or two, often described in historical sources as a time of prayer, reflection, quiet conversation, light tasks, or intimate activity. Then came second sleep, another period of rest that lasted until morning. E. Kirch found evidence for this pattern in an extraordinary range of sources: medical texts, legal documents, diaries, letters, prayers, and literary works. The language of first sleep and second sleep appears in texts from across Europe and across the medieval and early modern periods in French, English, Latin, Italian, and other languages, always referring to the same phenomenon, always treated as unremarkable, as simply the way human nights worked. It was only in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, with the spread of artificial lighting that allowed social activities to extend later into the evening, that the first sleep and second sleep pattern began to be displaced by the consolidated sleep we know now. What this means for the people sleeping in this hall tonight is that the night will not be a simple continuous blank between waking and waking. At some point in the deep hours, many of them will wake. They will lie quietly or turn to the person next to them or get up to tend the fire or step outside briefly into the cold. The waking between first and second sleep was, in Kirch's reading of the sources, a time that medieval people associated with a particular quality of consciousness, a stillness of the world, a clarity of thought, a kind of slow, spacious awareness that the daylight hours did not permit. Some of the sources he found described the interval between sleeps as the best time for prayer, when the mind was neither tired as it is in the early evening, nor rushing ahead to the day's demands as it is in the morning, just present, just awake, in the dark, in the warmth, with the fire lower than it was. We will come back to that waking, but for now, the evening is still going on. The fire is still at its working strength. The hall is still occupied by people who are awake, and I want to spend some time with what they were doing in these last hours before first sleep, because the evening in a medieval great hall was its own distinct world with its own distinct pleasures, and some of those pleasures are ones that I think we have more in common with than we might expect. Earlier in the evening, before the household began its slow drift towards sleep, there was a storyteller. I want to be careful here about the word entertainer, because it carries modern connotations that are not quite right. It suggests a professional hired for an occasion, someone brought in from outside to perform and then dismissed. This sometimes happened. Travelling minstrels and tumblers and jugglers did move from hall to hall, especially around the major feast days, offering their skills in exchange for hospitality. But the storytelling that happened in great halls most evenings was usually something else. It was internal to the household. It was performed by someone who was part of the community, who ate in the hall and slept in the hall, and whose telling of stories was part of the fabric of the evening in the way that conversation is part of the fabric of an evening. Not a special event, but a normal activity. Medieval households employed, in their various ways and at various levels of formality, people whose role included narrative and music. The minstrel, in the strict technical sense, was a professional musician, often with a specific instrument, the harp or the citolet or the vielle or the bagpipes, who was engaged as a member of the household and served alongside the other officers in the evening hall. The status of minstrels varied enormously. The minstrels of a great lord's household, the royal minstrels who served the Plantagenet and Lancaster kings, were well-paid, well-housed, socially respected members of the court. The minstrel of a minor household might be little more than a servant with an additional skill. But the function was consistent across the range. The provision of music and narrative in the evening, the marking of the time after supper as a time of rest and pleasure, and the particular engagement of the imagination that story and music provide. What did they perform? The canon of medieval entertainment is vast and various, and it changed considerably over the period we call medieval, but there are some consistent strands. The romances were perhaps the most prestigious form, long narrative poems about knights and quests and love and honour, and the particular code of chivalric behaviour that was simultaneously an ideological system and an entertainment product in the medieval period, as pervasive and beloved and commercially successful as any narrative genre we know today. The romances of Chrétien de Troyes in French and the English romances that followed them, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the alliterative Morte Arthur, the romances of the Breton lay tradition, these were the stories that a minstrel in a great household would know and perform, sometimes reciting from memory, sometimes working from a written text, always adapting to the audience and the occasion. Below the formal romance tradition, there were the fabliaux, the funny stories, often bawdy, often involving clergy in undignified situations or merchants being outwitted by their wives or servants making fools of their masters, the comic tradition that ran beneath the high chivalric tradition, the way earthworms run beneath a lawn, essential and usually hidden but breaking the surface at regular intervals to everyone's considerable amusement. The fabliaux were not performed in quite the same way or in quite the same context as the romances. They belonged to the lower end of the hall, to the after-supper hour when the lord had perhaps retired and the company had loosened, to the kind of evening that this evening is becoming. And below the fabliaux there were the riddles. Riddles deserve more attention than they usually get from people thinking about medieval entertainment, because riddles in the medieval world were not children's puzzles. They were a serious intellectual form with a long history, reaching back through the Old English riddles of the Exeter Book to the Latin tradition of Symphosius and Aldhelm, which itself reached back to the classical tradition of the riddle contest. The Exeter Book, that extraordinary manuscript compiled around the 10th century that survives in Exeter Cathedral, contains nearly 100 riddles in Old English, covering subjects as diverse as fire and ice, and a bookworm and a plough and a ship, and, in the case of number 47 in the scholarly numbering, something that has been entertaining scholars for centuries as to what it actually is. The riddles are witty, precise, often suggestive in ways that exploit the ambiguity of description, asking you to hold two possible solutions in your mind simultaneously, the innocent and the not innocent, and to decide which one the riddler actually intended. In the Great Hall, riddles were a form of communal game, a way of engaging everyone in the room in a shared intellectual activity that required neither expensive props nor special training, only attention and wit. The riddler posed the riddle, the company attempted answers. The right answer produced a small triumph. The wrong answer produced mockery that was meant to be good-natured and usually was, and the whole activity generated a quality of collective attention that was both social and genuinely intellectual. But tonight, in this particular evening, the formal entertainment of the earlier hours has wound down. The storyteller who was performing after supper has finished. There may have been music for a time, perhaps still is in the background, someone with a citole, a small guitar-like instrument playing something soft and repetitive in a corner, the notes clear and rounded in the way that plucked strings sound in a stone room, present without demanding attention. The conversation in the hall has settled into the small-scale kind, the particular talk of people who have been together all day and are now in the final hour before sleep, whose conversation is not about anything in particular, whose talk is the verbal equivalent of the warmth of the fire, not informative, not purposeful, just the sound of being together. I want to tell you about the songs, not the formal music of the minstrel's performance, but the other music that ran through the medieval hall more quietly and more constantly, the work songs and the seasonal songs and the sacred songs that were part of the texture of daily life in a way that makes modern music listening, with its headphones and its private consumption, seem extraordinarily solitary by comparison. Music in the medieval world was by default communal and participatory. The idea of listening to music performed by professionals while remaining entirely passive as an audience was not absent, but it was not the primary relationship most people had with music. Most people sang. They sang at work because work was repetitive and rhythm helped, and because singing together coordinated physical labour in ways that increased its efficiency and decreased its tedium. They sang sacred music in church because the liturgy was largely sung, and participation was expected. They sang at the major seasonal celebrations because those celebrations were organised around communal song. They sang informally in the evenings because the evenings were long and communal. Singing filled them in a way that nothing else quite matched. The music they sang was not simple. The tradition of part singing, of harmonising voices in organised polyphony, was present in England from at least the 13th century and probably earlier. The rota or summer canon known as Summa Isiacamen in, possibly the oldest extant round in Western music, dates from around 1260, and was almost certainly not an unusual or sophisticated piece when it was written. It was a popular song, written for singers who could be expected to know how to produce a four-voice canon from a single written part. The level of musical literacy required for this was not exceptional. It was the ordinary musical competence of people who grew up with music as a daily practice. In the hall tonight, in the quiet after the formal entertainment, there may be singing. Something slow and simple, something that everyone in the room knows, a carol in its original sense, which was not a Christmas song specifically, but a song with a repeated chorus that the company could join in, the soloist or the small group carrying the verses and everyone coming in together, on the burden, the refrain, the part that needs no particular knowledge or skill, just willingness. The sound this makes in a stone hall with a fire burning and 30 people participating is not the sound of a concert. It is the sound of a room becoming momentarily one thing, all the individual voices finding a shared vibration that is larger than any of them alone. The sound rises to the timber roof, and the carved angels look down at it in the shifting firelight, and the sound fills the space between the floor and the roof in a way that makes the space feel smaller, more enclosed, warmer than it was before the singing started. There is a reason every tradition that has ever wanted to create community has used communal singing to do it. Every religious tradition, every military tradition, every political tradition with a vision of collective identity. They all, independently arrived at the same technology, because it works, because the act of producing the same sounds at the same time with other people does something to the nervous system that very little else does, something about synchrony and shared attention, and the particular vulnerability of opening your mouth and letting sound out in front of other people, something that drops the barriers between people faster and more reliably than almost any other activity. The people in this hall have been singing together, working together, eating together, and sleeping together in the same room for months. Their nervous systems know each other. Their bodies are calibrated to each other's rhythms in ways that are not conscious but are real. The steward knows the sound of the page's sleep breathing. The kitchen workers know each other's morning routines before the morning happens. The squire knows which of the dogs always moves toward him at night, and which one stays near the hearth. This is the texture of communal life, the fine-grained mutual knowledge that develops when people share space continuously over time, and it is something that the modern world, with its private apartments and its individual routines and its carefully maintained separateness, has made considerably rarer. I'm not proposing that we go back to sleeping 30 people on rushes around a central fire. I want to be clear about that. But I do find myself thinking, when I sit with this material, about what has been gained and what has been traded away in the move toward private spaces and individual rooms and the particular kind of aloneness that modern domestic life makes both possible and, for some people, unavoidable. There is something in the hall that I think about. The sound of other people breathing, the knowledge that you are not alone in the dark, the fire that belongs to everyone. The supper has been over for several hours now, but I want to go back to it, because the meal that happened in this hall this evening was not merely the consumption of food. It was the central event of the social day, a performance of hierarchy and generosity and communal identity that is worth understanding in detail, because everything that is happening now in the quiet after-supper hour is the aftermath of it, is shaped by it, is the hall coming down from the particular heightened state that mealtime in a great hall produced. Supper in a medieval great hall took place in the late afternoon or early evening, the exact hour varying by season and household custom. In winter, with the days short, it was often earlier, around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, allowing the meal to be conducted while there was still some natural light to supplement the torches and candles. The meal was preceded by a set of preparations that were themselves a kind of ritual performance of the household's organisation and competence. The trestle tables were brought out and set up. The boards, the actual flat timber planks that formed the table surface, were balanced on the trestles and covered with white linen tablecloths. The quality of the linen, its whiteness and its weight, and the care with which it was pressed and laid, was a statement about the household in the same way that the quality of the food was a statement. A household whose tablecloths were dirty or poorly laid was a household whose management was failing. This was not trivial. The philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, made the perhaps unexpected point that a well-appointed table was not vanity, but proper expression of the dignity of the occasion. Hospitality had its own theological backing. The vessels were laid out on the tables, the drinking cups and the salt cellars and the knives, and then the diners came in. The order of entry was itself a kind of procession, a statement of rank expressed through movement and timing, and who walked through the hall doors in whose company. The lord and lady would typically enter after the rest of the household was already assembled, a choreography that placed them at the centre of the room's attention at the moment of their arrival, and everyone who was standing would bow, and everyone who was seated would rise, and then the meal could begin. The salt cellar. I want to spend a moment on the salt cellar because it is one of those objects that sits at the intersection of the practical and the symbolic in a way that tells you almost everything you need to know about how medieval people organised their world. Salt was expensive. I know this has been noted before in other contexts, but in the specific context of the table, it takes on a particular form. The salt cellar of a great household was not a modest condiment container. In wealthy households, it was a centrepiece of the table, an object of significant craftsmanship, often made of silver or gilded metal, sometimes of elaborate design, sometimes shaped as a ship or a castle or an animal. The one that sits on the high table in this hall is silver, shaped as a lion rampant, its hollow back containing the salt that will be used tonight. It is heavy. It has been in this household for 2 generations. It is one of the objects that would be inventoried in the event of the Lord's death. that would appear in the household accounts as a valued item of plate. The position of the salt cellar on the table was not arbitrary. It sat at the centre of the high table, and everyone in the hall understood its significance immediately. Those sitting above it, between the salt and the lord, were people of the highest rank and favour. Those sitting below it, further down the table, were of lesser standing. The phrase "below the salt," which we still use today when we want to indicate that someone is not quite in the inner circle, not quite in the room where the important decisions are made, comes directly from this physical reality. The salt cellar in the middle of the table, the lord at one end, rank decreasing as the distance from the lord increased. The food itself came from the kitchens in what the household management literature of the period called a remove, a course served all at once on large shared dishes from which the diners helped themselves or were served by the servers who moved between the kitchen and the hall. The number of removes at supper varied with the formality of the occasion and the wealth of the household. On ordinary evenings in a prosperous but not royal household, 2 or 3 removes was typical. Each remove might include several dishes served simultaneously, meats and pottages and sauces and bread. The dishes clustered at each table section in arrangements that were themselves organised by rank, with the best dishes nearest the lord and the lesser dishes further down. The specific dishes on this particular November evening, in a house of this kind, in this period, would draw on the resources of the estate and the season. It is well past Michaelmas. The summer's canning and salting is done. The pigs and cattle that could not be kept through the winter have been slaughtered and salted into barrels. The dovecote has been providing pigeons for the table throughout the year. The fish pond in the lower garden, stocked with bream and pike, has been contributing to the fast day meals. Tonight, on an ordinary Wednesday, is a fast day, which means no meat, and the kitchen has produced a supper of fish and pottage, and bread that is good by the standards of the period, but not extravagant. There was salted herring, soaked and then cooked in a sauce of verjuice and onions and herbs, sharp and savoury, the kind of dish that requires serious bread to eat properly. There was a pottage of dried peas enriched with some cream from the dairy, something white and thick and substantial that sat in its earthenware bowl, holding the heat longer than the other dishes. There was dried stockfish that had been beaten with a mallet for 20 minutes, and then soaked for most of the day, and then cooked in almond milk with spices, a preparation that transforms the rock-hard dried fish into something tender and fragrant, and considerably more appealing than the raw material would suggest. There was bread of several kinds, the finest white manchet loaves at the high table, coarser wheaten bread for the lower tables, the hierarchy of bread expressing the hierarchy of the household in every direction. To drink there was ale, the daily drink of everyone in the household from the lord to the youngest page, brewed in the brewhouse behind the kitchens and consumed in large quantities, because it was, in the medieval period, considerably safer than the water and considerably less intoxicating than wine. The ale brewed in a great household was not the strong ale of the feast days. It was small ale, lower in alcohol, produced quickly and consumed fresh, tasting of grain and yeast with a slight bitterness from the herbs used to preserve it before the widespread use of hops. Wine was available for the lord's table and for honoured guests. It had come from the household's wine cellar, purchased from a merchant in the nearest town who had obtained it from a Bristol or Southampton importer who had brought it from Gascony or the Rhine Valley, a chain of commerce that stretched from this hall in the English countryside to the vineyards of southwestern France. The meal lasted perhaps an hour, perhaps slightly less. The pace of a medieval meal was not the lingering 2 or 3 hours of a modern dinner party. Food was served, food was eaten, food was cleared. The ritual elements, the grace before the meal, the formal presentation of dishes, the carving of any roasted meats by the designated carver, these were deliberate and unhurried. But once the eating began, it moved at the pace that hunger set. And when it was finished, when the tablecloths had been removed and the vessels gathered, and the trestle tables cleared if not yet folded, when the lord and lady had retired upstairs and the formal part of the evening had ended, the hall settled into the state it is in now. The fire still burning, the dogs rearranging themselves, the company diminished but present, the conversation quieter, the air carrying the ghost of the supper, the smell of cooked fish and onions and the particular yeasty warmth of ale, layered over the permanent basement smell of smoke and rushes and dogs. This is the hour I want to stay in, not the meal itself but the aftermath of the meal, the long quiet evening before sleep, the particular quality of a room that has fed everyone in it and is now simply present with them. Let me tell you what darkness actually was in this period, what it felt like to a human body that had never experienced anything else. We have no real reference point for this. Even the darkest night any of us experience in our ordinary lives is punctuated by light. We did not put there the glow of a distant city on the horizon, the red light of a phone charging on the bedside table, the blue glow of a street lamp filtering through a curtain. The background light of the modern world is so pervasive that complete darkness, the kind that produces genuine disorientation, is now something you have to seek out, something you find in a cave tour with the lights off, or on a very dark night far from any settlement, or in the carefully light-controlled environment of a sleep laboratory. In the medieval world, darkness after sunset was simply the condition of the night. It was absolute in a way that no modern person in a developed country has experienced. The darkness outside the hall tonight is not metaphorical. There is no ambient light from any human source anywhere in the landscape. The stars are brilliant because the sky is clear, and the light of stars in a pre-industrial sky undiluted by any human illumination was something the medieval world had access to that we do not. A sky so full of light that the Milky Way was not a faint suggestion, but a broad road across the heavens that you could read by on the right night. But that light does not penetrate walls. Inside the hall, after the last torch gutters out, the only light is the fire. The medieval relationship with darkness was not the modern relationship with darkness. Modern people, especially those with any degree of anxiety, tend to fear darkness as a potential container for threat, a space in which danger cannot be seen and therefore cannot be prepared for. This fear is not irrational. It is the legacy of a long evolutionary history in which darkness was genuinely dangerous, in which the things that could hurt you moved in the dark and you could not see them coming. But for most modern people, this is a background anxiety rather than a practical reality, because the spaces we occupy after dark are lit, and the threatening things have mostly been removed. For medieval people, the darkness was more practically real. The hazard of moving in darkness without light was genuine. The uneven road, the unfenced well, the gap in the bridge, the animal in the road. But the people who spent their lives with genuine darkness developed what the darkness actually is. Not an absence, not a void, but a different perceptual condition with its own qualities. Darkness sharpens hearing. Darkness changes the relationship between people in the same space because visual individuation decreases and the other senses step forward. Darkness encourages a particular quality of thought, less visual, more interior, more given to memory and imagination, and the kind of long, unhurried reflection that the daytime with its constant visual demands does not permit. The monastic tradition understood this explicitly. The liturgy of the hours, the divine office that organized the monastic day into a sequence of prayer times stretching from before dawn to after dark, included prayers specifically designed for darkness. Compline, the final prayer before sleep, and matins or vigils, the prayer in the deepest part of the night. The darkness of these prayer times was not incidental to their quality, it was essential to it. The particular receptivity of the mind in genuine darkness, the particular quality of attention that the absence of visual stimulation produces, was understood by the monastic tradition as a spiritual state with its own character, its own possibilities. In the hall tonight, the torches on the walls have guttered out one by one as the evening has progressed, and each extinction has changed the quality of the room. With each torch gone, the fire has become relatively more important, more central, more the organizing principle of the light and therefore of the attention of everyone present. The hall has contracted around the fire. The far end, the screen's passage, the entrance, has dropped into genuine shadow. The middle distance, where the upper tables were, is dimly present. The area around the fire is lit with the moving, breathing, orange-red light of wood burning well, and the faces of the people near the fire are illuminated from below and from the side in the way that fire illuminates faces, making them look different from how they look in daylight. Older, more complex, the shadows creating depth in the features that the flat, even light of day erases. I want to talk about candles, because candles in the medieval hall were not used in the way we casually imagine when we picture the romantic candlelit medieval feast. Candles were expensive. Beeswax candles, which burned cleanly and had a pleasant faint honey smell were extremely expensive, reserved for the church and the wealthiest households and the most formal occasions. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were considerably cheaper and considerably worse in almost every respect. They smoked, they smelled, they needed to be snuffed and trimmed regularly to keep them burning cleanly, and even when well maintained they produced a light that modern assessments have calculated at approximately the equivalent of a single watt incandescent bulb, 1 watt. The light of a single tallow candle, the primary domestic artificial light source of the medieval period, was sufficient to illuminate approximately the area around the candle itself, nothing more. A great hall required substantial numbers of candles to be functional after dark, and a great household maintained a chandlery, a candle-making operation, as part of its domestic economy, rendering tallow from the fat of the animals slaughtered in autumn and forming it into candles that would be used throughout the winter. The chandler was a member of the household staff. The making and maintenance of candles was a recognized domestic skill, and the consumption of candles in a great household was tracked in the household accounts with the same careful attention as food and fuel, because candles were an operating expense that added up. What this meant in practice was that candles were used selectively. Not every space was lit. Not every activity was performed under artificial light. Reading and writing, tasks requiring detailed vision, were done as much as possible in daylight or near the best available light source. After dark, tasks that could be done by feel or by the light of the fire were done that way, and artificial light was reserved for the things that genuinely required it. This was not deprivation. It was simply the economy of light in a world where light was a resource that had to be managed. The hall tonight is using the fire. The fire is enough. The people near it can see each other's faces and each other's hands and the general shape of the room. The dogs can be seen and avoided. The distance between a person's seat and the place they will sleep is manageable in this light. The last cups of ale can be drunk and the conversation can wind down and the eyes can grow heavy, and all of this can happen in the light of wood, burning in a hearth, because that is all the light that is needed for any of it. I want you to notice, if you're lying in the dark right now, what the darkness is actually doing. Notice how the other senses have stepped forward. The sounds in the room, the sounds of the building settling, the sounds from outside, the feel of the blanket and the pillow, the particular quality of the air. In the dark, these things become larger, more present. The visual world has quieted down, and the other worlds have expanded to fill the space it left. This is what the people in the hall are experiencing, the gradual darkening of the hall as the torches go out and the fire settles, the gradual expansion of the other senses as the visual world contracts to the radius of the fire. The world getting smaller and warmer and quieter all at once. This is one of the things the hall does well. It gathers the world inward. I've been circling around the animals because the animals in a medieval great hall are one of those realities that modern sensibility finds genuinely difficult to accommodate, and I want to be honest about that difficulty rather than smoothing over it, because the difficulty itself is revealing. The dogs we have already met, but there were other animals. In the first place, rats. A medieval great hall containing food stores, rushes, dogs and human food waste was by definition a place where rats were present. The medieval relationship with rats was not the modern relationship, which is primarily one of disgust and extermination. Medieval people knew rats were a problem. They kept cats and terriers specifically to control rat populations. They stored food in elevated or sealed containers where possible. But they also understood that rats in the spaces where humans lived were simply a fact of life that could be managed but not eliminated, not with the tools available to them. A great hall in winter had rats. Everyone knew this. The dogs and cats kept the population down. The rushes, renewed periodically, removed some of their habitat. But rats were present, and the sound of them moving in the walls and in the deeper layers of the floor rushes was part of the texture of the nighttime hall. The cats of a great household served a specific and recognized function. They were not pets in the modern sense. They were working animals, maintained for their utility in controlling vermin, valued for their effectiveness in this role, and treated with a practical appreciation rather than the kind of emotional investment that characterizes modern pet ownership. A cat that was an effective mouser was a good cat. A cat that was not effective was a less useful asset. The relationship was not unaffectionate. There are medieval references to cats that suggest genuine fondness, including the 9th century Irish monk's poem about his white cat Pangur Ban, probably the most famous cat in medieval literature, in which the scholar notes the cat's pleasure in hunting mice with his own pleasure in intellectual work and finds them companions in their parallel pursuits. But the companionship was between a person and a working animal, not between a person and a dependent with a name and a specific food and a special place in the family hierarchy. There may also be, in this particular hall on this particular evening, a hawk. The great houses of medieval England kept hawks. Falconry was not merely a pastime, it was a practice so central to the identity and culture of the medieval nobility that the entire vocabulary of falconry made its way into the English language as a set of metaphors and idioms that we still use without knowing their origin. To be hoodwinked is to have the hood of a hawk placed over your eyes, obscuring your vision and preventing you from startling. To be fed up is the falconry term for a hawk that has been given enough food and is therefore no longer hunting keen. To be at someone's beck and call uses beck, from the Middle English term for the gesture used to call a hawk to the fist. The social world of medieval falconry is embedded in the English language so deeply that it is invisible. Hawks in a great household lived in a mews, a building specifically designed for their housing and management, and they were attended by a falconer whose knowledge of the birds was specialised and valued. But on some evenings, particularly in winter when the birds were being kept in from the weather, a hawk might be brought inside and kept on a perch in the hall, hooded still, its presence as much decorative as practical, a visible sign of the lord's sporting pursuits and social identity. A hooded hawk on a perch in a firelit hall is one of the most arresting sights in the medieval domestic repertoire. The bird does not move, or moves very little, a slight adjustment of balance, a slow turn of the head, the talons shifting on the perch. Its feathers, which in daylight reveal themselves as brown and grey and buff, take on a warm amber quality in the firelight, and the small leather hood over its head gives it a look that is both confined and dignified, a wildness that has been contained but not reduced. People in the hall might glance at it periodically the way you glance at something beautiful and living and quietly improbable in your ordinary domestic space. The horse, if I am being thorough, was technically not in the hall itself, but it was close. The stables were typically adjacent to the main hall complex, close enough that in very cold weather the heat of the animals contributed something to the adjacent buildings, close enough that the sounds of horses at night, their movements and their breathing and the occasional stamp of a hoof on straw were part of the nighttime acoustic landscape. The boundary between indoor and outdoor in a medieval great house complex was more permeable than modern domestic architecture suggests. The buildings were connected. The animals were nearby. The smells of the stables were not absent from the air of the hall on a night when the wind was coming from that direction. None of this is presented as an argument that medieval domestic life was preferable to modern. I want to be clear about that. The rats were a genuine problem. The smoke was a genuine health hazard. The cold at the far end of the hall was real cold, the kind that caused real suffering. I am not engaged in the peculiar nostalgia that romanticizes pre-modern life by focusing only on its picturesque aspects while ignoring its grinding difficulties, but I do think there is something worth noticing in the medieval Great Hall's relationship with the natural world, which was characterized by proximity rather than the careful exclusion that defines modern domestic space. Modern domestic architecture is organized around the principle of separation. Humans inside, animals outside, warmth inside, cold outside, light inside, dark outside. Smell managed and controlled inside, the natural world with its complexity of odours kept at bay. This separation has produced enormous benefits in terms of hygiene and comfort and the control of disease vectors. But it has also produced something else, a kind of perceptual impoverishment, a shrinking of the sensory world available to a person spending time in their own home, a reduction of the textures and sounds and smells that the natural world provides, down to the narrow, controlled, managed comfort of the heated, lit, sealed interior. The people in this hall are cold and smoky and sharing their space with rats and dogs and a hawk and the smell of horses. I am not saying this is better than being warm and clean in a private room, but I am saying that their sensory world, on this particular winter evening, contains the fire and the smoke and the sound of animals breathing, and the cold pressing against the walls, and the particular smell of rushes and tallow and wood ash. and this specific group of human beings who have been together all winter, and that this world, for all its difficulties, is rich in a way that has something to do with the presence of the natural world in it, the refusal of the environment to be entirely managed, the ongoing negotiation between the human desire for warmth and comfort and the winter's persistent effort to provide neither. The moment I've been building toward is coming. It is late. The hall has gone quiet enough that the fire is audible, not just visible but audible, the low constant sound of wood burning, the occasional creak of a settling log, the soft breath of the coals, the rare pop of a pocket of sap in the oak giving up its moisture to the heat, in a small sharp report that makes one of the sleeping dogs lift its head and then lower it again. The trestle tables have been folded. This happened perhaps an hour ago, the boards lifted off the supports and stacked against the wall, the trestle supports folded and laid beside them, the floor cleared. The sleeping pallets have been unrolled, the straw-filled linen sacks and the wool blankets brought from wherever they are stored during the day and arranged on the rush-covered floor in their customary positions, near the fire for those of higher rank, further away for those of lower. People are already on their pallets. Some are already asleep. The squire has been asleep for perhaps half an hour, his long body arranged on the pallet with the instinctive efficiency of someone who has been sleeping on a floor since childhood, one arm under his head, the blanket pulled up. The page who was laughing earlier is also asleep, his face in sleep looking much younger than it did an hour ago, the pretension of adolescence gone, just a boy with his cheek against his arm and his mouth slightly open. The steward is still awake. He is the last one awake with any regularity at this hour by habit and by responsibility. He is the one who will bank the fire tonight. Banking the fire was not a casual task. I want to explain exactly what it involved and what it required, because the care with which it was done was the care that stood between the household and a cold dawn, and the cold dawn was not a mere inconvenience. A cold hearth in a medieval hall in deep winter meant, at minimum, a delay in the morning's cooking and heating while the fire was rebuilt from scratch, a task that in the best of circumstances took 15 to 20 minutes, and in the worst of circumstances, with numb fingers and damp wood and bad luck, could take an hour. It meant a cold hall for those who slept in it. It meant cold food for the household's morning. In extreme cold, it could mean frozen pipes and frozen larder and a cascade of practical difficulties that rippled through the day. The steward rakes the fire. This is where I want to slow down. To stay in this moment, this specific physical act, because it is one of those moments where the distance between the medieval world and our own collapses in a way that surprises me every time I think about it. The act of tending a fire at the end of the night is not mediated by any technology. The fire does not care about the century. The steward's hands are performing the same physical calculation that fire tenders have been performing since the first time a human being discovered that a fire correctly managed could survive the night. He uses a long-handled iron rake to pull the burning logs away from each other, separating them so that they do not continue to burn against each other and consume themselves through the night. He does this slowly and deliberately, the iron rake scraping across the stone of the hearth floor with a sound that is different from any other sound in the hall, metallic and deliberate. The dogs do not stir at this sound. They have heard it every night of their lives. Then he rakes the glowing coals, the deep red and orange heart of the fire, the coals that have been burning all day and are now dense and long-lived and radiating heat in steady waves, rather than in the leaping theatrical way of fresh wood, to one side of the hearth. The coals together, a mound of living heat. Then he rakes the grey ash, the soft accumulated ash of months of burning that sits on the hearth floor and must be managed as carefully as the coals themselves, over and around the coal mound, not smothering it, insulating it. The ash is a brilliant thermal insulator, one of the best available to a medieval fire tender. Packed around the outside of the coal mound, the ash keeps the heat in, preventing the coal from losing its warmth too quickly to the cold air of the hall. It also prevents the coal from getting enough oxygen to continue burning at full strength, keeping it alive at the minimum level required, just enough air coming through the ash layer to sustain the coal's ember quality through the night. The skill in banking is finding exactly the right depth of ash. Too little, and the coal burns freely, consuming itself and producing heat and light through the night, but potentially burning out before morning or, in the worst case, sending sparks onto the floor rushes. Too much ash, packed too tightly over a coal that is not dense enough, and the coal dies in the night, its warmth slowly exhausted, and the morning begins without a fire. The steward knows how much ash. He has been doing this his entire adult life. He does not measure, his hands know. He places a larger piece of ash-covered log across the front of the banked mound, half burned but no longer flaming, its surface grey with ash, but its core still hot enough to contribute to the insulation, without adding significantly to the combustion. This is the outer wall of the bank, the visible face of the sleeping fire. From the outside, from across the hall, the banked fire does not look like much. It looks like ash, a grey mound with a low orange glow at its heart, barely visible. Not the fire of an hour ago, not the high dancing flames, not the brightness, just a small warm centre underneath the grey. This is the fire that will be here in the morning. I want you to think about what this represents. The steward is doing something that requires no particular intelligence, no particular skill beyond what he has accumulated over years of practice. He is moving ash with a rake. But what he is doing, in the most fundamental sense, is making a decision that the morning matters, that the household that will wake in this hall deserves a fire already burning when they wake, that the cold of the night is not going to be allowed to win entirely. He is placing a bet on tomorrow. He's doing this in the dark, in the quiet, after everyone else is asleep, because it is his responsibility, and he takes his responsibility seriously, and because in the world he lives in, taking your responsibility seriously is not a corporate value statement. It is the reason you have a place to sleep tonight. There is something about the banking of the fire that I keep returning to, something that exists at the intersection of the physical act and its meaning. The ember that survives the night is not the same fire that burned through the day. It is a different state, lower, quieter, more potential than actual. It is the fire in waiting. It contains the day's fire in its core, the memory of it, and it will become the morning's fire when the right conditions are applied, when fresh fuel is added and the ash layer adjusted, and the breath of a bellows or a human lung stirs the coal back to life. The word for this in Latin focus, the focal point of the house, means the hearth. When we say that something is the focus of our attention, we're using a word that originally meant the fire at the centre of the home, the thing everything else in the space oriented toward, the source of warmth and light around which the household organised itself. The fire at the centre, the focus. The steward straightens up. He stands for a moment looking at the banked fire, at the low orange glow at its heart, satisfying himself that it is right, that the ash is deep enough, and the coal is dense enough, and the night will not be cold enough to extinguish it. Then he puts the rake down with a quiet deliberateness and steps back and looks around the hall. The hall is mostly dark now. The fire gives enough light to see the shapes of the sleeping bodies, the pale blur of a blanket here, the curve of a shoulder there, the long shape of a dog. The hawk on its perch near the far wall is a dark shape against the darker shadow. The tapestries on the walls are barely visible, just the suggestion of colour in the minimum light. The carved figures in the roof are invisible. The hall has gone back to what it was before human beings put a fire in its centre and a roof over their heads. Not darkness exactly. Something deeper than darkness. The darkness of stone in winter. The darkness of a space that has been holding cold for months. The particular quality of enclosed darkness in a building that has stood through 20 or 30 or 100 winters and will stand through 20 or 30 or 100 more. The steward goes to his pallet. He lies down. He pulls the blanket up. The hall breathes. Now we're in the deepest part of the night. The hour between first and second sleep, that liminal period that Roger E. Kirch found, described across centuries of European historical sources, is coming. Not for everyone, not all at once, but the bodies in this hall are on the ancient schedule, the evolutionary schedule, and some of them are beginning the quiet surface from the first depth of sleep toward the waking that will come before the second. The fire has reduced itself further since the banking. It is a genuinely small thing now, the glow at the heart of the ash barely brighter than a distant candle, casting light in a radius of perhaps 6 feet, that illuminates nothing in particular. The stone of the hearth, the close weave of the ash over the coal, the reflection of the glow in the polished iron of the fire dogs that flank the hearth. The rest of the hall is dark. The cold has moved in from the walls a little further now that the fire is lower, and the people near the edges of the room have pulled their blankets tighter without waking. There is no silence in this hall. I want to be accurate about this. Complete silence in a space containing 30 sleeping humans and a dozen dogs is not possible. What there is instead is a sound landscape that is entirely different from the waking landscape, just as the light landscape is different. The individual sounds are smaller and less varied. There is breathing, the collective breath of 30 people, which in a stone room is not nothing. There is the occasional sound of someone turning in their sleep, the rustle of straw and wool, the creak of a plank. There is a dog that is dreaming, a faint yip and a brief scrabble of paws against the floor and then quiet again. There is the fire, the very low continuing sound of coal burning slowly under ash, a sound so small and steady that you only notice it when you are specifically listening for it, when the rest of the sounds have diminished enough to let it forward. The cold outside is doing something to the building. The temperature differential between the interior of the hall and the exterior, perhaps 20 degrees of difference at this hour, is producing the slow movement and settling of the stone and timber that old buildings make at night, a language of small creaks and shifts that the people who live in this building know so well they do not register it as sound at all. It is the building's nighttime voice, the sound of materials contracting and settling and doing the microscopic work of maintaining their integrity under thermal stress. It is the sound of the hall taking care of itself. Let me tell you what a person waking in the interval between first and second sleep in this hall would experience. They wake, not sharply, not with the alarm-induced adrenaline jolt of modern waking, but gradually surfacing from sleep the way you surface from deep water, slowly, with time to notice what the water feels like before you reach the air. They are aware first of warmth, or the degree of warmth that the blanket has preserved, the microclimate of their own body heat caught under wool. Then of the weight of the blanket itself, the particular heaviness of a wool blanket that has been used all winter and is now soft with use. Then of the floor under them, the straw pallet between their body and the stone, the way the straw has compressed under their weight into a form that is specific to them, that holds the shape of their sleeping body. Then they are aware of the hall, the darkness, the quiet, the very low glow of the banked fire at the centre of the room, the sound of other people breathing. There is a quality to this waking that is different from any waking I know of in the modern world. Ekirch noted in his reading of the historical sources that people who wrote about the waking between sleeps consistently described it as a time of unusual clarity, a sense of being very awake and very still simultaneously, of the mind being fully present without being burdened by urgency. Some sources described it as the best time for prayer. Some described it as the time when the problems of the day could be held at a distance and turned over calmly, without the pressure of the need to act. Some simply described lying in the dark in the warmth of the blanket, and listening to the hall, and thinking long, slow thoughts that had no particular direction. What were those thoughts? The people lying awake in this hall in the deep of this winter night had their own interior worlds, as different from each other as any 20 or 30 people's interior worlds are different. The steward might be reviewing something about the household accounts, a calculation that had not quite resolved in the evening, turning it over now in the dark where there was nothing to distract him. The squire might be thinking about the knighting ceremony, still years away but already imagined in considerable detail, the sword on the shoulder, the spurs, the particular feeling of a future he was working toward arriving finally. The kitchen worker near the wall might be thinking about her family, about a sister in a village 2 days' ride away, about a letter she has not sent because writing costs money she does not have. The page might be thinking about absolutely nothing at all, his young brain doing what young brains do at the intersection of sleep and waking, which is to produce a succession of vivid and entirely disconnected images that have no narrative logic, but that feel, while they are happening, as real and immediate as anything that happened in the waking day. What connects all of them in this hour, what makes the waking between sleeps a single experience even when its content is entirely personal, is the hall itself, the darkness, the warmth of the banked fire still present even at its reduced strength, still radiating through the ash, the sound of the other sleepers, the stone walls holding the cold outside, the timber roof above, invisible in the dark but present in the way that ceilings are present, the known limit of the space, the boundary between inside and outside, the particular quality of being enclosed, of being inside on a winter night, of having walls between yourself and the cold that is doing its patient work on the other side of them. This is something that medieval people understood in a very direct physical way that modern people, wrapped in central heating and double-glazed windows and the comprehensive infrastructure of the modern built environment, understand less viscerally. The shelter was not guaranteed. The warmth was not automatic. The fire had to be made every day and maintained every night and banked with skill and care against the morning. The winter was genuinely threatening in ways that required skill and preparation and collective effort to navigate. And having navigated it, having gotten through another day and another evening, and into the relative warmth of the hall with the fire banked and the blanket pulled up and the other bodies breathing nearby, the experience of shelter was something that could be actually felt, not taken for granted, present, real. A warmth that was warm specifically because the cold outside was cold. We have insulated ourselves from this experience so thoroughly, and for such good reasons, that I think we have sometimes lost access to it even as an imaginative possibility. We have made the background of winter irrelevant to our daily experience of shelter, and in doing so we have also made shelter itself less present, less felt, less of an active experience and more of a passive condition. The people sleeping in this hall are not living in a better world than ours. They are living in a harder world than ours in almost every measurable sense. But their relationship to warmth, to shelter, to the banked fire that is going to be there in the morning, is one of genuine felt experience rather than managed background condition. The warmth is warm to them because the cold is cold. The shelter is shelter because the outside is real. There is something in this that I want to offer you as you lie in your own warmth tonight. Not a moral, not an instruction, just a possibility. The warmth you are lying in right now is real warmth. The blanket that is over you is doing real work. The house, or the room, or the building you are in is holding the cold outside in the same way that the stone hall holds the cold outside, with the same physics, the same basic logic of boundary and insulation, and the human desire for a space that is warmer than the world around it. The technology is different, the materials are different, the degree of reliability is entirely different. But the fundamental experience of being inside on a winter night, of having a known warm space to come back to, of lying under something that holds the heat your body makes, is the same experience that every human being in this hall is having right now. It has been the same experience for as long as there have been winters and human beings who needed to survive them. The warmth you're lying in right now is continuous with the warmth of that hall, not metaphorically, literally. The warmth of a sleeping human body under a blanket is the same warmth, is produced by the same metabolism, is the same physical fact. You are warm right now for the same reason those people were warm, because you are alive and your body is doing what living bodies do, and the thing covering you is preventing that warmth from dispersing too quickly into the air. This has been true for every winter that has ever been. It will be true for every winter that comes. The person lying awake between first and second sleep in the medieval hall understands this in their body, not as an idea but as a fact of flesh and cold and wool and fire, and the particular grace of waking in the dark to find that the warmth is still there, that the fire is still there, that the morning is coming. There is a dog walking. Not the dreaming one from earlier, a different dog, one of the greyhounds, who has slept and woken and is now moving through the hall with the quiet, precise steps of a dog who knows exactly where it is going. It is going to the fire. Not to the fire as it was earlier, the brilliant working fire of the evening, but to the ash-covered coal mound at its centre, which is still warm in the specific way that a banked fire is warm, radiating at a lower frequency than flame, a steady, pervasive warmth rather than a sharp directional heat. The greyhound circles twice, the ancient dog motion of making a bed in grass that does not exist, and lies down on the warm hearthstone, its thin sides against the warm stone, its long head on its paws, and within a minute its breathing has slowed back to the long, even rhythm of animal sleep. The hall is quiet again, quieter than before the dog moved, because now the quiet includes the dog settled at the hearth, because the small motion is resolved and the hall has returned to its minimum acoustic state. I want to tell you about the particular sounds of a stone building at night in winter. This is something that people who live in old stone buildings know, and people who do not are sometimes surprised by. Stone in cold weather makes sounds. Not dramatic sounds, Not the sounds of distress, but the sounds of a material with significant thermal mass responding to temperature changes, the microscopic movements of mineral structures as they cool through the night, the infinitesimal shifts at the mortar joints where the stones meet, the occasional sound like a single note struck quietly on a very large instrument that happens when a large mass of stone completes a thermal movement and settles. These sounds are very low and very intermittent. They are, in the acoustic ecology of a sleeping building, so familiar to the people sleeping in it that they register only as background, only as the building's nighttime self. The wind outside is slight. There is enough of it to find the gaps in the shuttered windows, the small leaks in the stone joints, the space under the door at the far end of the hall, and through these gaps it enters the hall as not quite a draught, more a presence, a slight movement in the air that people sleeping near the walls would feel as a periodic marginal cooling. A reminder that the outside is just there, just past the stone, just across the wall. The rushes on the floor near the wall stir slightly when this happens. The hem of the nearest tapestry moves. The fire responds. Even a banked fire responds to air movement. When the slight draught from the wall reaches the hearth, the glow at the heart of the coal mound brightens very slightly, orange deepening in a pulse that lasts perhaps a second before the insulating layer of ash reasserts itself, and the glow subsides back to its minimum. This is the fire breathing. The fire is alive to the movement of air in the room in a way that no other light source is alive. It is the most responsive thing in the room, the most attentive, the most continuous in its awareness of what the air is doing. Somewhere in the middle of the night, a sound that is not part of the hall's own acoustic repertoire, a sound from outside, an owl. Not a dramatic sound, not the theatrical hoot of an owl in a film, but the actual sound of a tawny owl in a winter wood, which is a series of trembling notes that rise and then fall and then rise again, a sound that is simultaneously beautiful and unsettling, a sound that the medieval world heard differently from the way we hear it now. The medieval interpretation of the owl's call was complex. Owls were associated with wisdom, from their ancient connection to Athena. They were also associated with death, with the night, with the liminal space between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. A barn owl, pale and noiseless in flight, drifting past a window in the dark, was the kind of sight that made medieval people reflexively cross themselves. The tawny owl calling from the woods was less alarming, more integrated into the nighttime soundscape of the countryside, but still a sound that carried associations beyond the merely ornithological. No one in the hall wakes at the sound. It is an outdoor sound, a sound from the world on the other side of the walls, and the walls are doing their work of separation. But perhaps, in the light waking of the interval between sleeps, one person turns toward it, lies still for a moment listening to the owl in the cold wood outside, the sound coming through the stone wall attenuated but present, and something happens in that person that is not thought exactly, not feeling exactly, something closer to the experience of simply being alive and warm and enclosed on a winter night while the owl calls from the dark outside, being one of the things that is here right now on this particular winter night on this particular piece of ground, being temporary and present and warm. The owl calls twice more and is silent. The hall breathes. I want to step back from the night for a moment and give you some sense of what the day was before the evening that we have been inhabiting began, because the peace of this evening, the fire burning, and the people settled and the hall doing its work of shelter is the product of a day of labour that I think deserves to be acknowledged, even if only briefly before the night swallows it. A great medieval household was, in terms of its labour requirements, more like a small factory than like anything we would recognise as a home. The number of people employed in even a modest noble household, a household of perhaps 30 to 50 people, was significantly larger than the number of people living in it as family members. And the work those people did was the work of keeping the household functioning as an independent economic and social unit, a unit that produced most of what it consumed, that processed its own food and made its own fuel supply, and maintained its own buildings and managed its own accounts, and conducted its own correspondence, and organised its own defence and performed its own religious observances. The kitchens, which we have visited briefly, were running from well before dawn. The cook fires had to be lit first, before any cooking could begin, and lighting a cook fire in a medieval kitchen was not a matter of holding a lighter to a burner. It was a task that required the successful revival of a banked fire, or in the worst case, the construction of a new fire from scratch using flint and steel and char cloth, a process that on a cold morning with cold hands could take 15 minutes at best. The fire had to be at the right temperature for different kinds of cooking. The high intense heat of roasting required a different fire from the low steady heat of a day-long braise, which required a different fire from the moderate consistent heat needed for bread baking. The bread. The baking of bread for a large household was a daily operation. The bread making began the night before, with the mixing and initial fermentation of the dough, which would work through the night in the warmth near the kitchen fire, doing the slow, yeasty alchemy that transforms grain and water into something that rises and has structure. In the morning, the risen dough would be shaped, left to prove again, and then baked in the oven, a large stone oven that had to be heated for hours before the bread could go in, typically by burning wood directly in the oven chamber and then raking out the coals when the oven had reached the right temperature. The household accounts of major English noble estates from the medieval period, some of which survive in remarkable completeness, give us exact numbers for what a household of a certain size consumed in a day. The household of Dame Alice de Brienne, an Essex landowner whose accounts survive for the year 1418 to 1419, consumed on an ordinary day enough bread for perhaps 40 people, along with varying quantities of ale, salt fish or fresh fish depending on the day's religious status, and whatever could be procured from the estate's gardens and orchards and fish ponds in the markets of the nearby town. Dame Alice's accounts record the purchase of spices, the number of geese and chickens taken from the household's own stock, the quantities of grain used by the baker, the firewood brought in from the estate's woodland. They are extraordinary documents, giving us a granular picture of what it actually took to feed a medieval household on an ordinary day. It took a great deal, and behind every entry in those accounts there was a person whose hands had done the actual work. The grain had been ground in the mill, and the miller had been paid his toll, and the grain had been carried to the bakehouse, and the baker had woken before dawn to set his dough, and the firewood had been cut and split and carried, and the oven had been heated, and the bread had been made, and the bread had been brought to the hall and placed on the tables in the morning and in the evening, and this was Tuesday, and it would happen again tomorrow. The water had been drawn. This is something that I keep returning to in any discussion of medieval domestic life, because the simple fact of getting water from where it was to where it was needed was a labour requirement that the modern world has so completely automated that we cannot really feel its weight. Water for the kitchen, water for the bakehouse, water for the laundry, water for the horses, water for the brewery, water for washing people and pots and floors and linens. Water came from the well or the stream or the cistern, and it was carried in buckets or pots by human hands, and this happened every day, regardless of weather, regardless of season, regardless of whether the person carrying the water was feeling well or tired or cold. The fuel had been managed. The wood that burned in the Great Hall fire tonight had been cut from the estate's woodland, probably last winter or the winter before, because oak needs to season. It had been split into appropriately sized pieces. It had been stacked in the woodshed. It had been carried to the hall as needed by the people whose job it was to carry things, and these were typically the people at the lowest end of the household hierarchy, the people whose contribution to the household's functioning was their physical capacity to move heavy things from one place to another. They had been doing this since before dawn today. The animals had been fed and watered and their living spaces cleaned out. The horses in the stable had received their hay and their grain. The cows in the byre, if any cows were being kept through the winter, had been attended to. The pigs in the steer had been fed on kitchen waste. The poultry had been let out and fed and their eggs collected. The dogs had been given their morning ration. All of this had been done before the household's first meal of the day. And then the day's main work had begun, whatever the day's main work was. On a manor estate in November, much of the agricultural work of summer and autumn is finished. The harvest is in. The autumn slaughter is done. The preserving is underway. The winter work is maintenance and repair, and the internal work of the household, the mending of equipment and harness and clothing, the processing of wool from the autumn shearing, the management of accounts and rents, and the ongoing administration of the estate's resources. Not nothing, but a different quality of work from the driven urgency of harvest time, a more interior work, a work that happens inside buildings and in covered workshops rather than in the open fields. The hall that we're sitting in now, in its evening quiet, is the product of all of this. The fire that is warming the sleeping bodies and the dreaming dogs is the fire that was maintained all day by people whose names will not appear in any history of this estate. The rushes on the floor were laid and periodically refreshed by people who had done this work for years and knew how to do it well. The tapestries on the walls were hung and maintained and taken down for cleaning and rehung by people who understood their value and their fragility. The meal that the household ate this evening was produced by the combined labour of perhaps 20 people, working in coordination from before dawn to the moment the dishes left the kitchen. I find myself wanting to acknowledge this not in the abstract way that historical discussion often acknowledges the labour of the anonymous poor, with a sentence or two of appropriate recognition before returning to the named and the powerful, but in the specific, physical, actual way. The warmth in this hall tonight is the product of human bodies that spent today moving between the cold and the fire, between the outside and the inside, between the work and the brief rest that preceded more work. The warmth is not given, it was made. And it was made by people who have now finished making it for today, and are sleeping in the room whose warmth they produced, sleeping in the range of the fire they tended, and tomorrow they will do it again. This is not unusual, this is the ordinary human arrangement for most of human history. The warmth was not automatic. Someone made it. Someone makes it. I have been describing the hall with a kind of love, because I do feel something close to love for the material reality of these spaces, for the specific textures and smells and sounds of them, for what they represent in terms of human ingenuity and community, and the long effort to make winter survivable. But I want to be honest about something that the love for the hall's warmth and beauty can sometimes obscure, which is that the Great Hall was also a machine for the production and maintenance of social inequality, and that the inequality it produced was not incidental to its design, it was the design. The hall was not a neutral space. Every physical feature of it expressed and enforced a social hierarchy that was understood by everyone who lived in it as natural and God-given and permanent. The high table on its dais was literally higher than the floor of the hall because the Lord was supposed to be literally above the people who served him. The order of service at meals, from the highest to the lowest, was not merely a convention. It was a daily performance of who mattered more and who mattered less, enacted in food and drink and the particular quality of attention, directed toward different parts of the hall. The sleeping arrangement around the fire was not merely practical. It was a nightly reenactment of the hierarchy, the most comfortable positions for those of greatest rank, the least comfortable for those of lowest. The people at the lowest end of this hierarchy, the people sleeping near the walls in the cold, the people eating the pot scrapings and the dark bread, the people whose labour made the warmth that they themselves received the least of, were not unaware of this. Medieval people were not simpler or less perceptive than we are. They understood the arrangement they were living in. The tradition of social critique runs through medieval popular culture in the fablio, and the ploughman's tales and the peer's ploughman tradition, in the periodic risings of working people against the conditions of their labour, most dramatically in the Great Rising of 1381, when the labouring people of England marched on London and demanded, among other things, an end to the legal restrictions that bound them to particular lords and particular places. The anger was real. The critique was real. The inequality was understood as such. And yet the hall was also, genuinely and without contradiction, a community. The lord who managed his household badly, who failed to provide adequate food and warmth and shelter for the people who served him, was failing by the standards of the medieval social world, not just by ours. The household management literature of the period, texts like the Seneschalcy and the Fleta and the earlier Neckham's De Naturis Rerum, is insistent on the obligation of the lord to the household. Hospitality was a virtue that medieval Christianity took seriously. The Benedictine rule, which formed the template for the monastic hospitality that was the dominant model for domestic management in the period, required that guests and servants alike be received as if they were Christ himself. This was not merely rhetorical. The lord who failed to provide for his household was, in the theological framework that surrounded his daily life, failing before God. This does not resolve the inequality. The kitchen worker sleeping in the cold at the far end of the hall is still sleeping in the cold. The theological framework that told the Lord he should provide for his household did not automatically produce adequate provision, and even when it did not eliminate the hierarchy or the cold or the distance between the pot scrapings and the venison. But it does add something to the picture. The hall was not a pure power structure. It was a power structure embedded in a web of obligation and reciprocity that, when it functioned as it was supposed to function, constituted something more than mere domination. The word lord, as I mentioned earlier, comes from the Old English hlaford, loaf guardian, the person who controls the bread, and the word lady comes from hlefdige, loaf maker. At the root of the English language's vocabulary of power is bread, and the giving of bread, and the obligation to give bread, and the received understanding that the lord's power over the household was inseparable from the lord's obligation to feed the household. Power and provision, in the medieval conception, were not separate things. They were the same thing, expressed from two different sides of the same relationship. The great hall, with its fire and its hierarchy, and its communal sleeping and its dogs and its hawks and its rushes and its tapestries and its management of everything from the candle supply to the quality of the bread, was attempting, in its specific historical way, to hold these things together, the power and the provision, the rank and the community, the high table and the pot scrapings. It did not always succeed. The history of medieval social relations includes enough conflict and exploitation and grinding poverty to make any romantic reading of the hall dishonest. But the attempt was real. The obligation was real. And in the hall at its best, on a winter evening, with the fire burning well, and the household fed and the dogs settled and the songs finished and the night coming on, something was accomplished that was not nothing. Something was made. A world was made, small and hierarchical and smoky and impermanent, but warm and shared and lit by fire. It is the deepest part of the night now, the hour when the darkness outside has reached its maximum, the hour when the temperature outside has dropped to its lowest, the hour when the world is at its most committed to being night, when the distance between this and morning is at its furthest from both ends. The hall is very quiet, the occasional sound of someone in deep sleep, a particular quality of breathing that is not quite snoring, but is the sound of the body fully surrendered, fully given over to rest. The fire's residual warmth is still present but lower. The stone floor near the hearth warm to the touch. The stone floor at the far end of the hall cold. The dogs are all settled now, one at the hearth, two near the central pillar, several others distributed according to their personal preferences and relationships with the human bodies sleeping nearby. Outside the hall, the estate is entirely still. The village beyond the walls is entirely still. The roads are empty. The fields are dark and hard and silent. The woodland on the hill behind the manor is doing what woodland does at night in winter, which is to hold its breath, or to do something that looks from outside like holding its breath. The birds roosted and still, the larger animals bedded in whatever shelter they have found, the smaller animals active in ways that do not make much noise. The owl has been quiet for some time. The only sound outside is the very low sound of the wind, lighter now than it was earlier in the evening coming from the north, which means the temperature tomorrow will be colder than today. The stars through the gaps in the Louvre at the roof ridge are still there, still brilliant. If you were to lie on your back directly under the Louvre and look straight up, you would see a small irregular patch of sky, perhaps a foot across, bright with stars, the cold clear sky of a winter night in England that has never experienced light pollution, stars so thick and bright that you could navigate by them on a clear night, that the shepherds and the sailors and the ploughmen of this period used for navigation and timing, and the management of their seasonal work in ways that are largely inaccessible to modern people living under electrically illuminated skies. The fire beneath that patch of sky has been burning for a very long time. Not this specific fire, not the particular logs that were burning this evening, but a fire in this hearth, or a hearth very like it, in a hall very like this one. Winter fires in great halls of medieval England were not unusual events. They were the condition of winter life in these buildings, and they burned continuously through the months from October to April, maintained by the same daily and nightly practice of banking and reviving and adding fuel that the steward performed tonight. A fire in a hall like this might burn for 6 months without ever fully going out, the coal at the heart of each morning's banked fire carrying forward the chemistry of the previous day's burning into the next, a continuous thread of combustion that could run from October to April without interruption. The people sleeping in this hall tonight are sleeping inside something that has been burning for months. The smoke in the walls, the smoke in the timber, the smoke in the rushes and the blankets and the clothes of everyone in the room is the accumulated record of those months of burning. The warmth is not new. It has been being produced here in this space by people performing the same tasks for a very long time. There is a particular quality of thought that comes in the deepest part of the night, when the mind is in that liminal space between sleep and waking, when the noise of the day has completely subsided and the noise of the coming day has not yet begun. It is a quality of long vision, of being able to see things from further away than the day permits. The pressures and the urgencies that structure the waking day, the tasks that need to be done and the people who need something, and the problems that require attention, these fall away in the deep night, and what remains is something more essential. Not the what of the day, but the why. Not the tasks, but the texture of the life in which the tasks exist. The person lying awake in this hall in the deep of the night might think about the fire, about the coal at its heart surviving the darkness, about the morning that is coming, the same morning that has been coming every night of their life, the same grey light at the eastern shutters, the same moment when the banked fire is uncovered and new wood is added, and the flames rebuild themselves from the surviving coal, the same morning. Not the same as yesterday's morning, the morning that is always new because the day that preceded it was always different, but the same in the structure of it, the same in the fundamental shape, darkness, and then light, cold, and then warmth, the ember surviving and the fire returning. I find myself thinking about what it means to maintain a fire through the night. Not metaphorically, literally. The act of banking, of covering the coal with ash to preserve it, of making a deliberate decision that the morning matters enough to take care of it tonight, of trusting that the morning will arrive and wanting it to arrive to warmth. There is a faith in this act that I think is worth noticing. Not a religious faith, though it exists alongside religious faith and may be related to it in ways that are difficult to separate. A more basic faith. The faith that tomorrow will come, the faith that the ember will hold, the faith that the work done today in the cooling evening will produce warmth tomorrow morning. This is what the banked fire says, if a banked fire can be said to say anything. Not the present, not this moment, tomorrow. The fire being kept alive through the night is an argument that tomorrow is worth having warmth for. The darkness is beginning to change. Not in any visible way, not yet. The stars in the Louvre patch overhead are still bright. The hall is still dark. The fire is still the minimum glow it has been for several hours. But something is different. Some quality in the darkness itself has shifted. Some very small change in the colour or the depth of it that is probably imperceptible to anyone not specifically looking for it. But that the bodies of the people sleeping in this hall might register, that the dogs almost certainly register, that the long-practiced sense of experienced sleepers might notice without waking. The night is beginning to withdraw. This happens very slowly. The stars will remain visible for another hour at least. The hall will remain dark for longer than that. The shutters will not be opened. The Louvre will not be uncovered. The first sign of actual light inside the hall will be the faint grey brightening of the air near the eastern windows that happens when the sun is still well below the horizon, but the world is beginning to prepare for it. But the process has begun. The long, still deepest part of the night is over, and the night is now moving imperceptibly toward morning. In the monasteries of medieval England, this is the hour of matins, the first of the canonical hours, the hour of the night office, when the monks would rise in the dark and make their way to the choir and begin the long prayers and psalms of the night office, their voices rising in the cold stone church, their breath making small clouds in the candlelight, the sound of the chant filling the building with something that was simultaneously worship and music, and the management of time, the marking of the dark hours with human voice and organised sound. In the hall there is no formal marking of the turning of the night, but there is, in the interval between first and second sleep, a different kind of awareness. Some of the people in this hall are in that waking period, lying quietly in the dark with their eyes open, aware of the hall around them, aware of the fire's low presence, aware of the night being this specific night, this specific winter, this specific place. In their own ways, each of them is doing what the monks are doing in the monastery a few miles away. They are being present to the dark. They are marking the night with their wakefulness. The fire knows nothing of this, of course. The fire is not marking anything. The fire is simply doing what fire does, which is to consume fuel and produce heat and light, to exist in the present tense without past or future, to be entirely and completely what it is at any given moment. But the people watching the fire in the deep of the night, watching its low glow from their pallets in the dark hall, are doing something the fire cannot do. They are connecting this night to other nights. They are recognizing that this specific warmth, this specific darkness, this specific fire in this specific hall on this specific winter night is part of a continuity that reaches in both directions from this moment, back through all the winters that preceded it and forward into the winters that will come. The ember is still alive. This is the central fact of the night, the fact around which everything else in the hall is organized. The ember, buried under ash, is still alive. It has survived the night. When the steward wakes in his first morning waking, in the short, sharp waking before second sleep that will come in an hour or so, he will lie still for a moment, and the first thing he will do before any other thought forms is the thing that experienced fire tenders always do in the dark of the pre-dawn morning. He will listen for the fire, not listen for sound exactly, though a living coal makes a very faint sound, a barely audible sigh of oxidation that an experienced ear can detect. He will listen in the broader sense of orienting his attention toward the fire, of feeling for its presence, of taking in all the available information about the state of the hearth from his pallet 15 feet away. And he will know. Before he gets up, before he crosses the floor, before he bends over the banked mound and checks it with his hand, he will know from something in the quality of the air and the darkness and the faint warmth that is still reaching his side from the direction of the hearth. The fire is still there. The coal is still alive. The morning will be warm. He will turn over. He will close his eyes. He will sleep again. Second sleep is coming. The hall is moving toward it. The people in the waking interval between first and second sleep are feeling the subtle pull back toward rest, the way the body announces that it has had its interval of wakefulness and is now ready to continue the rest it began several hours ago. This second sleep will be shorter than the first. It will end with the dawn, with the grey light coming through the eastern shutters, with the first sounds of the household beginning to wake. But while it lasts, it will be the deepest and most peaceful sleep of the night, the sleep that comes after the watching, after the being present to the dark, after the ember has been confirmed. The fire is still there. The morning is coming. Sleep. I want to stay with you in the quiet before the ending, in the almost sleeping but not yet sleeping space, where the images of the evening are still moving through the mind, the fire and the dogs and the faces in the firelight, and the sound of the owl in the winter wood. I have been taking you through a winter evening in a medieval great hall with all the detail I can bring to bear. The specific smells of smoke and rushes and tallow, the specific sounds of the fire and the oak and the breathing bodies, the specific social logic of who slept closest to the warmth and who slept furthest from it, the specific physical skills required to maintain a fire through a winter night and wake to find it still burning. I have done this not to give you a catalogue of historical facts, though facts are involved, but because I think there is something in the specificity, in the texture of the material reality of this place and this time, that the general does not provide. What the hall gave to the people who lived in it was warmth and shelter and food and community. These are not small things. In the 14th and 15th centuries in England, for a person of a low social status, they were not guaranteed. The hall's provision of them, however unequally distributed, however embedded in a hierarchy of obligation and subordination, was a genuine provision. The kitchen worker sleeping near the wall of this hall tonight is sleeping warmer and more securely than a landless labourer in a village cottage with no fire, no banked coal, no steward whose job it was to ensure the morning's warmth. The hierarchy of the hall is real and unjust. The provision within it is also real. What the hall asked was labour, every form of it. The physical labour of the kitchen and the woodshed and the well, the organisational labour of the steward and the chamberlain and the household officers, the skilled labour of the cook and the baker and the brewer and the chandler, the creative labour of the minstrel and the storyteller, the patient labour of the fire tender who stayed awake a little longer than everyone else to bank the coals so that the morning would be warm. The hall asked all of this labour continuously every day, and it received it, and in return it provided what it provided: warmth, food, shelter, community, a place in the world. This is not a trade that we would recognise as fair by modern standards. The people at the top of the hall's hierarchy received the better part of its provision while doing less of its labour. The people at the bottom did more of its labour and received less of its provision. This was not a secret. It was not a misunderstanding. It was the explicit, God-endorsed, legally enforced structure of the medieval social world. The inequity was fundamental. And yet the hall was also a community, in the specific sense that community means a group of people who share space and resources and labour and risk, and the long, slow texture of daily life. The steward near the fire and the kitchen worker near the wall were in community in a way that the CEO and the cleaning staff of a modern corporation are not in community, because the hall genuinely enclosed them, genuinely required their cooperation, genuinely made them dependent on each other's contribution. The cook who failed to produce bread meant everyone went without bread, including the steward. The fire tender who failed to bank the coals meant the steward woke to a cold hall, not just the kitchen workers. The interdependence of the hall was real. I am not arguing that this made the hall good. I am arguing that it made it real in a way that is worth thinking about. The hall's flaws were real. Its warmth was real. Its inequality was real. Its community was real. These things were not contradictions. They were the texture of the place. The fire is at its lowest now. The ash is deep over the coal, and the glow is barely visible. In a few hours the hall will begin to wake, the grey light coming first through the shutters, then sounds from the kitchen, then the steward rising and crossing to the hearth, and the morning beginning in its slow, deliberate way. The day will begin again, the fire will be revived, the bread will be made, the water will be carried. The day will be exactly like this one in structure, different in its particulars, the same in its essential shape. The fire and the cold and the warmth and the work and the evening and the sleep. But that is tomorrow. Tonight is still tonight. The hall is still. The fire is still there. The dogs are still sleeping. The stars are still bright in the Louvre above. The tapestries are still moving in the very slight draught from the walls. The carved angels in the roof are watching everything and nothing in the minimum light. Their stone faces unchanging, their stone wings spread as they have been watching through every night of this hall's life. Everything is here. Everything is still. There is something about the very edge of sleep, the place just before consciousness dissolves, that I want to spend a moment in with you. Not the sleep itself, the place just before it. You know this place. Every person who has ever been alive has been in this place. The specific quality of awareness that exists when the body has let go but the mind has not yet let go completely. When the images of the day and the evening are still moving through the mind's eye but they have lost their urgency, lost their edges, become something more like weather than like thought, something that moves through rather than something you hold and examine. In this hall, in this moment, in this winter night, the images that move through the minds of the people in that liminal space are the images of the day. The fire as it was in the morning, the faces around the supper table, the sound of the minstrel's music before it stopped. The particular quality of the cold air when the hall door was opened and someone brought more wood in from the stack outside, and the winter air came in with the wood for a moment, cold and clear and smelling of frost, before the door closed again and the warmth reasserted itself. The feel of the blanket being pulled up, the low orange of the banked fire seen through half-closed eyes. These are not dramatic images. They are not the images of a life in extremis, not the images of crisis or triumph, or the large turning moments that make it into history. They are the images of Tuesday, the images of an ordinary winter evening in an ordinary place, ordinary by the standards of this time and this world, which means extraordinary by any standard we might bring from outside it. The smoke in the walls, the wool of the blanket, the warmth of the fire, the stone of the floor, the breath of the person sleeping nearby, the low ember at the heart of the hearth, surviving, waiting, keeping faith with the morning. Let these images be the last ones, not because they are better than others, not because this place and this time and these specific people have any particular claim on your attention beyond the attention you have given them tonight, but because they are quiet, because they are warm, because they have done what they needed to do, which is to carry you through an evening in a room that is not yours, and a world that is not yours, and a warmth that is not your warmth, into the specific quality of rest that comes from having been somewhere for a while, having been fully present in it, and then allowing it to release you. The fire is banked, the hall is quiet, the night is passing. You are warm. The ember is still there. The morning is coming, as it has always been coming, as it will always come, reliable and unhurried, bringing with it everything the day will require, the grey light first, then the sound of the hall beginning to wake, then the smell of the revived fire and the morning's bread, then the full returning world with all its weight and all its colour and all its particular demands. But that is not yet, that's the morning. Right now is still the night. Right now is still the dark and the warmth and the low ember and the sound of the hall breathing and the stars visible through the Louvre and the dogs and the tapestries and the carved angels watching through the dark from the roof. Right now is this. You are here. Sleep. Final act autre. The fire is still there. This is the morning now, but only just. The grey light has not quite arrived. The eastern shutters are still dark. The hall is at the very edge of night, in the last few minutes before the world decides to be day again, and in this last stillness, in this in-between that is neither night nor morning, the fire that was banked last night is still alive. The ash is deep over the coal. The glow at the heart of it is small, smaller than it was even at its low point several hours ago, but it is there. It is alive. The coal has done what coal does when it is correctly banked and carefully tended. It has survived the night. In a short time, perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps 20, the steward will wake. He will be aware of the hall before he is aware of himself. He will lie still for one moment, as he does every morning, and in that moment the morning's inventory will complete itself without his directing it. The warmth, still present at his range from the fire. The sounds of the hall, the particular quiet of early morning before anything has begun. The light, the darkness still complete but with some quality in it that his body recognizes as the quality of morning, not night, the very beginning of the approaching day. He will get up. He will cross the floor carefully in the dark, stepping around the sleeping bodies he knows are there by long habit, stepping over the dog at the hearth without disturbing it. He will kneel at the fire. He will put his hand carefully, not directly on the ash but close to it, feeling for heat, confirming what he already knows. The fire is there. He will take the rake. He will move the ash slowly back from the coal, exposing the live heart of the fire to the morning air, and the coal, which has been breathing very slowly all night under its insulating blanket, will respond to the increased oxygen the way a living thing responds to morning air, with a brightness, a deepening of the orange glow, a beginning of heat that is less potential and more actual than it was a moment ago. He will add kindling, small dry sticks that have been kept near the fire to stay dry, their brittleness the brittleness of very low moisture content, exactly what a fire needs to rebuild itself from a coal. He will lay them carefully on and around the brightening coal, not smothering it, not blocking the air it needs, just offering it the fuel it is ready to take. The kindling will catch, will become small flames, and the small flames will grow. The fire is coming back. It was here all night. It was here in the dark and the cold and the long quiet hours when the hall held its breath and the stars watched through the Louvre. It was small and covered and waiting, but it was here. It kept faith with the morning, and the morning arriving now in its grey and gradual way, with the first faint lightening of the eastern shutters and the sound of a bird outside, the first bird, the first voice in the silence of the winter morning, the morning keeps faith with the fire. On the table near the window there will be objects from last night that have not been moved. A cup still holding the ghost of last night's ale. A knife set down between courses and not picked up again. A small piece of bread, hardened overnight in the cold air of the hall, left on the edge of the trestle table by someone who set it down meaning to return to it. The fire is building. The hall's beginning to know itself again in the light. The tapestries are re-emerging from the dark, the colours deepening as the grey morning light comes through the gaps in the shutters, the hunting scenes and the saints' lives becoming themselves again. The dogs are beginning to stir, the first movements of animals whose internal clocks have already told them that morning is here even before their eyes confirmed it. One of the dogs, the greyhound that settled at the hearth in the deep of the night, raises its head, looks at the fire, lowers its head again. Not yet, a little longer. The world outside the hall is still very quiet. The frost has deepened overnight. The track that leads to the village has hardened further. The woodland on the hill is still and white-tipped. But the darkness is withdrawing. It is doing what darkness does every morning, retreating before the returning light in a movement so gradual and so continuous that you can never quite catch it happening, can only notice that at some point the dark that was complete is no longer complete, and the world is becoming visible again in its specific winter beauty, cold and clear and etched with frost. The fire is burning now. Not the large working fire of yesterday evening, not yet, but a real fire, a fire with ambition, a fire that is taking the new fuel the steward is adding to it and converting it into heat and light with an efficiency that speaks to the quality of the coal that survived the night. The stone of the hearths around is warming. The air near the fire is warming. In perhaps half an hour the warmth will extend to the radius it held last night, and the sleeping bodies in the hall will begin to feel it reaching them even through their sleep. The morning is here. The fire is here. The hall is waking up, slowly in its own time, in the particular gentle pace that a winter morning in a stone building with a fire demands. Not rushed, not startling. Just beginning, the way things begin after they have survived a night, with the specific quiet confidence of something that has been through the dark and come back to the light and knows, from having done it before and the time before that and the time before that, that this is what happens. The dark comes, the dark passes, the fire is still there, the morning comes. You are here too. You have been here all evening, in the rushes and the smoke and the warmth and the quiet. You have heard the storyteller and the songs. You have watched the fire at its working height and at its banked minimum. You have been present for the long still hours of the night, for the waking between sleeps, for the owl in the winter wood, for the very first lightening of the eastern shutters that means morning. Now the morning is taking over, and the hall's work is beginning again, and the day that is coming is going to need the fire and the warmth and the bread and the water and all the labour that yesterday needed, and the day will be lived, and the evening will come again, and the fire will be banked again, and the night will be survived again. This is what the hall does. This is what it has always done. This is what it will do tomorrow and the day after that and through all the winters still to come. The ember survived. The fire is burning. The morning is here. I want to take you back before the fire was burning, before the rushes were laid, before anyone was sleeping in this hall at all. I want to take you to the building of it, because the people who built the hall are as much a part of it as the people who live in it, and the building of a great medieval hall was one of the most ambitious and technically sophisticated undertakings that a medieval lord could commission. The decision to build a new hall, or to substantially rebuild an existing one, was not made lightly. It required capital that even wealthy lords accumulated slowly and carefully. It required the engagement of skilled craftsmen who were in high demand and moved between commissions across considerable distances. It required the extraction and processing of enormous quantities of raw material from the land and the quarries and the forests of the estate and the surrounding country. And it required something that I find genuinely moving when I think about it in this context, a commitment to a future that the builder might not live to fully inhabit. The great stone halls of medieval England were not built quickly. A substantial hall, with its prepared foundations and its coursed stone walls and its timber roof and its fitted windows and its fireplace arrangements and its ancillary buildings, might take 3 to 5 years to complete from the breaking of the first ground to the first fire in the new hearth. The lord who commissioned such a hall was making a commitment that extended well beyond the immediate term. He was saying, with the investment of his resources and his organisational energy, that this place would exist after him, that the family that bore his name would live in these walls for generations, that the warmth and shelter and community that the hall provided would be provided not just for his own years, but for the years of his children and their children. This is a form of faith that the modern world has made more difficult, though not impossible. We do not often build things that are designed to last 200 or 300 years. We do not often plant trees we will never sit under. The medieval lord who planted an oak grove near his hall was planting for a future he would not see, for a timber supply that would mature in a century when his great-great-grandchildren would cut it. The medieval mason who laid the foundations of a great hall was laying stone that he expected would bear the weight of the building and its occupants for a very long time. The stone of this hall was quarried from a site perhaps 20 miles away. The quarrymen who worked that site were specialists, men with specific knowledge of how to read the rock, where to place the wedges, how to split the stone along its natural grain without shattering it. The stone was rough cut at the quarry and then transported by cart along the tracks that served as roads in the medieval English landscape, the carts heavy and slow, the horses straining on any slope, the progress measured in miles per day rather than miles per hour. It took weeks to bring the stone from the quarry to the building site. At the building site, the master mason took the rough stone and turned it into walls. The master mason of a great medieval building project was not merely a skilled labourer. He was an architect, an engineer, and a manager of complex operations responsible for translating the Lord's intentions into physical reality, responsible for solving structural problems that had no textbook solutions, responsible for understanding the behaviour of stone under load in ways that no formal education had ever taught him, and that he could not have articulated in theoretical terms, but that his hands and his eyes and his accumulated experience had made into reliable intuition. The plumb line and the set square, the scratch dial for marking time, the straight edge and the level. These were the master mason's primary instruments, and from them, combined with the geometry that he had learned from other masons in the apprenticeship tradition of his trade, he produced buildings whose structural logic still impresses engineers today. The hall we are sitting in has walls that are thick enough, and foundations that are deep enough, and the geometry of its roof is correct enough that it has been standing for several hundred years, and may well stand for several hundred more. This is not luck. This is the embodied knowledge of generations of craftsmen, passed down through demonstration and practice, expressed in stone and timber, and the specific quality of attention that skilled workers bring to work they take seriously. The carpenters who made the timber roof were working at the limits of their material. Oak bends under load, joints move as the wood seasons further after construction. A timber roof of the scale of a great hall is a dynamic structure, shifting very slightly over time in response to temperature and moisture, and the long, slow creep of wood under compression. The master carpenter who designed and built this roof understood these behaviours not through calculation, but through feel, through the same accumulated bodily knowledge that the mason brought to the stone, the knowledge of what oak does and what it will not do, and how to work with its nature rather than against it. The result of all of this, the result of the quarryman and the carter and the mason and the carpenter and the roofer and the plasterer and the painter and the glazier and all the labourers who supported their work, is the hall we are in. This specific arrangement of stone and timber and plaster and glass and ironwork that encloses the fire and the people and the dogs and the warmth. It was built by human skill and human labour and human intention. It holds the cold outside because those people understood stone and understood load and understood how to put one stone on another stone and one timber beside another timber in the particular way that keeps the building up and the rain out and the walls plumb for centuries. When the steward banks the fire and goes to his pallet, he's sleeping in the work of craftsmen who died before his father was born. The hall contains them. The walls contain their specific decisions. This stone and not that one, this joint and not another, this angle of the roof pitch that makes the drainage work correctly in heavy rain. The building is a record of their knowledge in the same way that a musical score is a record of a composer's intentions. You can read it if you know how, and even if you cannot read it, you can live inside it and benefit from it every single day. This is one of the things about the medieval built world that I find most moving. The accumulated intelligence embedded in structures that were built to last. The specific knowledge of specific craftsmen encoded in stone and timber and plaster and preserved for centuries by the weight of the building itself, which presses down and holds everything in place. The hall is a kind of memory, a memory of labour and skill and intention and the specific desire of specific people to make something that would endure. The hall we are in on this November evening is the hall in its winter state, and I want to give you some sense of how different that is from the hall in its other seasons, because the hall was not a single fixed experience, but a changing one, its character shifting with the seasons in ways that affected everything from the quality of the light to the mood of the people living in it. In summer, the hall was a different world. The fire in the central hearth still burned, because cooking required fire and the morning and evening chill in England even in summer required heat. But it burned at a lower and less constant intensity, more of an intermittent presence than the constant companion it was in winter. The shutters were open during the day, admitting light and air in quantities that the hall never experienced in the dark winter months, and the quality of that light was entirely different from the firelight of evening. White and clear and directional, falling in slanted beams through the high windows and illuminating the dust motes in the air and the colours of the tapestries with a fidelity that firelight never achieved. The rushes in summer were more recently changed, because the warmer weather meant they fouled faster, and also meant that the cutting of new rushes from the riverbank was practical. The hall in June or July smelled of fresh rushes, and the herbs strewed through them, meadowsweet and pennyroyal, and the sharp green smell of cut grass, and the dogs were less inclined to press against the hearth, and more inclined to sprawl in any cool corner they could find. The people were different in summer too, or the same people were different. The indoor sedentary quality that the winter imposed, the gathering around the fire, the long evenings enclosed together in the warmth, gave way to a more expansive life. People were outside more, the agricultural work of the estate was at its peak intensity, and even the members of the household who did not directly farm were affected by the seasonal rhythm, working longer in the light, eating earlier, sleeping when the light went rather than when the cold drove them inside. The hall was where you went when you were not outside rather than, as in winter, being where you were. The great feast days punctuated this seasonal variation with their own specific characters. Christmas was the winter feast, the midwinter celebration that the Christian tradition had overlaid on the pre-existing solstice celebrations of Northern Europe, and it gave the deepest part of winter its moment of deliberate excess. The Christmas feast in a great hall meant more food, better food, the best wine from the cellar, more candles, more music. The 12 days of Christmas that ran from December 25th to January 6th were in theory 12 days of celebration and feasting, with the Feast of the Epiphany on January 6th, being in many households the climax of the Christmas season rather than its beginning. The hall in the Christmas season was the hall at its most theatrical, its most deliberately performed, its most fully itself as a machine for the expression of hospitality and community, and the particular medieval understanding of the sacred duty to celebrate the great feast days with appropriate generosity. Easter was the spring feast, and after the weeks of Lenten restriction, it had the quality of genuine relief. No more salted herring, no more dried stockfish, no more the particular grey stodginess of the fast day table. Meat again, fresh greens from the garden, the first dairy of the season. The Easter celebration in a great hall was characterized by the specific pleasure of things restored, of the prohibited becoming available again, of the body's winter-long hunger for fat and protein being finally and legitimately addressed. Midsummer was the Feast of St. John, celebrated on June 24th with bonfires and outdoor festivities that moved the celebration outside the hall and into the landscape itself. The bonfires of midsummer were enormous, built from the trimmings of the hedgerows and the residue of the spring's coppicing, and they were lit with deliberate ceremony at dusk when the summer sky was still light enough to see by, but the fire was visible against it, and the people of the household and the village gathered around them in the long warm evening and celebrated with something that was simultaneously Christian and considerably older than Christianity, a celebration of light at the height of its power, a ritual acknowledgement of the sun's generosity before the slow turning toward darkness began. Michaelmas on September 29th was the autumn reckoning, the feast that marked the end of the agricultural year and the settling of accounts. The harvest was in. The slaughter of the animals that could not be kept through the winter was beginning. The preservation work was underway. Michaelmas was the time of payment, of the settling of rents and the resolving of debts, and the feast that followed it had a quality of completion, of the year's work done and accounted for, that the summer feasts with their open-ended warmth did not have. It was a particular kind of satisfaction, finite and specific, the satisfaction of having gotten through another year and being ready, as far as you could be ready, for the one that was coming. The hall experienced all of these seasons. Its stone walls absorbed the heat of summer and the cold of winter. Its roof collected and shed the rain of autumn and the snow of winter and the weight of summer heat. Its fire was at its minimum in the warmth of June and at its maximum in the cold of February. Its rushes were green and fragrant in spring, and dark and compacted and richly complex in their odour in February. Its people were more expansive in summer and more interior in winter. The hall was alive to the year in the way that any building in direct conversation with the seasons must be alive, responsive, changing, different in its character from month to month while remaining essentially and continuously itself. And underneath all of that seasonal variation, constant and unmoved by it, was the stone and the timber and the hearth, and the central fact of the fire. The fire that was lit in October and maintained through April, and then reduced to the kitchen fires of summer, and then returned to the hall in October again, year after year, the same hearth, the same position, the same function, the same daily requirement of care and attention, and the specific skill of the banking. The hall survives its seasons because it has been built to survive them, because the people who built it understood the requirements of stone and timber and fire and weather and human community, and because the people who maintain it, the steward and the cook and the fire tender and the chandler and the rush cutter and the carpenter, who repairs what time damages, do their work season after season with the same patient consistency that the seasons themselves maintain. There is a way in which the great hall, enclosed by its stone walls and its timber roof and its banked fire, can seem to be a world unto itself, complete and sufficient, requiring nothing beyond its own resources. I have been presenting it something like this, and it is a legitimate way to experience a medieval hall, as a microcosm, a world in miniature, everything that is needed contained within the walls. But the hall was not a hermetically sealed world. It was embedded in a much larger web of connections and dependencies that reached far beyond the estate and far beyond England, and the fire and the food and the cloth and the spices and the wine that the hall required to function came from that web. Understanding where those things came from, how they travelled, what chain of human labour and commerce and organisation brought them from their origins to this specific hearth and this specific table adds something to the experience of the hall that the closed internal view cannot provide. The wine in the steward's cup came from Gascony, the region of southwestern France that was an English possession through much of the medieval period, and whose vineyards supplied the English market with the wine called claret, a light red that was the standard table wine of the English nobility. It left the vineyards of Bordeaux in October or November, in oak barrels on Gascon ships, crossed the Bay of Biscay, entered the Bristol Channel or the Thames estuary, was unloaded at Bristol or Southampton or London, was purchased by a merchant, was transported by road or river to a market town near the estate, was purchased from that merchant by the household's buyer, and was transported by cart to the estate's cellar where it was stored until it arrived at this table. This journey took weeks, involved the labour of dozens of people, crossed 2 countries and 1 stretch of open sea, and resulted in a cup of wine that the steward is now drinking without thinking very specifically about any of it. The spices in the kitchen, the ginger and the pepper and the small quantity of saffron that the master cook keeps in his locked box, travelled further, much further. The pepper came from the Malabar coast of southwestern India, grown in the long strips of pepper vine that hung between the taller trees in the coastal forests. It was harvested by hand, dried in the sun, and then carried by small coastal vessels to the port of Calicut or Cochin, where Arab merchants who specialised in the spice trade purchased it and loaded it onto the larger ships that crossed the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea. From there it travelled overland through Persia or Egypt to the Mediterranean, where Venetian or Genoese merchants purchased it at the spice markets of Alexandria or Acre and transported it to Venice or Genoa. From those cities it moved north and west through a network of medieval European trade routes, the great overland routes through the Alpine passes or the maritime routes through the Strait of Gibraltar, until it reached the spice markets of London or Bristol, where it was purchased at the price that made even common pepper a luxury item, and from there it made its way through the same chain of merchants and buyers and carters that brought the wine, to this kitchen, to this locked box, to the pinch that the master cook measured out carefully for tonight's fish sauce. This journey took perhaps 2 years from the vine in India to the dish on the high table. It involved the labour of Indian farmers and Arab sailors and Persian merchants and Egyptian middlemen and Venetian traders and Alpine carters and English merchants and household buyers and kitchen staff, hundreds of people across thousands of miles of ocean and land, all connected by the chain of value that made pepper worth more than its weight in silver by the time it arrived in England. The world that produced the winter evening in this hall was a world of extraordinary and largely invisible complexity, a world of trade routes and commercial networks and specialist knowledge and the specific human skills required to move valuable goods reliably across great distances. The cloth of the tapestries on the walls came from Flanders, where the great textile cities of Ghent and Bruges and Ypres maintained weaving industries whose products were sold across all of Western Europe. The iron of the fire dogs came from the forest of Dean, where iron ore had been smelted since the Roman period and where the techniques of ironworking had been accumulated and refined over 15 centuries. The lead of the window came from the lead mines of Derbyshire or Somerset. The glass, if there is glass in these windows, came from glassmakers in the Weald of Kent or from imported Rhenish or Venetian craftsmen. Everything in this hall, every material object, every piece of food, every fabric and every metal and every stone that is not the native stone of the local quarry, arrived here through a chain of production and commerce that reached well beyond the estate. The hall was not isolated. It was connected through its consumption and its needs to the whole apparatus of medieval economic life, to the wool trade and the grain trade and the wine trade and the spice trade and the metal trade and the textile trade, to the ships and the carts and the pack horses and the river barges that moved goods between the places that made them and the places that used them. The fire in the hall is burning English oak because English oak was what was available and what was managed and what had been selected over generations of practice as the best fuel for a hall fire in the English climate. But the wine and the spices and the cloth and the metal on this fire tell a different story. The story of a hall that was the final destination of goods that had travelled, in some cases, from the other side of the known world. This is not a contradiction of the hall's character as a specific local embedded place. It is an additional dimension of it. The hall was local and global simultaneously, rooted in the specific soil and stone of a particular English landscape, and connected through commerce and consumption to a network that reached India and Gascony and Flanders and Derbyshire, and all the points in between. The smoke in the walls is English oak smoke. The pepper in the fish sauce is Malabar pepper. Both are here, both are part of what the hall is. I want to give you language. The people in this hall spoke a version of English that we would find difficult to follow if we could hear it, but recognisable as the ancestor of the language we're using right now, the language in which I am speaking to you and in which you are hearing me. Middle English, the English of the medieval period, was a language in transition. It had come from the Old English of the Anglo-Saxon period, which was in turn descended from the Germanic languages that the Angles and Saxons and Jutes had brought to Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries. It had absorbed an enormous quantity of French vocabulary in the centuries following the Norman conquest of 1066, when the ruling class of England spoke a dialect of French called Anglo-Norman, and the administrative and legal and religious language of England became French rather than English. The result was a language of extraordinary richness and complexity, a language with two complete vocabularies for many things, the Anglo-Saxon word and the French word, the earthy and direct and the elegant and Latinate, the words for the animal in the field, and the words for the same animal on the plate, pig and pork, cow and beef, sheep and mutton, the one vocabulary from the people who worked with the animals and the other from the people who ate them. The language you would hear in this hall tonight would vary by the social level of the speaker. The steward, managing accounts and correspondence, would use a language that was somewhat more formally influenced by the French administrative vocabulary, comfortable with terms drawn from Latin and French. The kitchen workers, whose daily lives were organised around direct physical work, would use a language closer to the Anglo-Saxon base, earthier, more direct, full of words that have survived into modern English in their most common and most physical forms, the words for fire and water and bread and cold and work and sleep and pain. In between, in the squire and the pages and the minstrel and the various members of the household who occupied the middle ranks, a language that moved between these extremes depending on context and company, code switching in the way that bilingual or bidialectal people do in any period, moving between registers as the social situation demands. The prayers that were said before and after meals in this hall were in Latin. The liturgical language of the medieval church was Latin, and the prayers and the grace and the spoken forms of religious observance were conducted in a language that most of the people in the hall could not speak conversationally, but that they knew by ear, knew the sound of, associated with the specific quality of attention and seriousness that sacred speech carries. The priest or the household chaplain who said grace over the supper table was speaking Latin, and the people who heard him and who made the sign of the cross and said Amen at the appropriate moment were participating in a linguistic ritual that connected them to the universal church, to the same words being said in the same language in every Christian household and monastery and cathedral across Europe at that same moment. This is one of the remarkable things about medieval Christianity as a linguistic phenomenon. The Latin liturgy was genuinely universal. The same words of the Mass were being spoken in Winchester and in Rome and in Lisbon and in Prague and in the Crusader churches of Jerusalem and the mission churches of Lithuania, all on the same day, all in the same language, the same specific forms of words that had been fixed for centuries and would remain fixed until the Reformation of the 16th century disrupted the linguistic unity of Western Christianity. A medieval English merchant travelling to Florence, or a French pilgrim travelling to Santiago de Compostela, or a German diplomat travelling to London could walk into a church anywhere in Catholic Europe and follow the Mass in exactly the same language they used at home. Latin was the internet of the medieval intellectual and religious world, the shared protocol that made communication possible across the diversity of vernacular languages. The songs sung in the hall earlier this evening were in English, or in the mixture of English and French that characterised much medieval lyric poetry. The melodies were known, carried in the memory of everyone in the room who had been learning them since childhood. The words were English words, words that the people singing them used in their daily speech, words that the emotion of singing gave a different weight and colour than their ordinary conversational use. The word love in a medieval love song and the word love in a medieval conversation were the same word doing different work, the song lifting it into a register of intensity and beauty that ordinary speech rarely achieved. The conversations in the hall right now, the last quiet conversations of the evening before sleep, are in the ordinary English of daily life, the English that does not get recorded in manuscripts, and does not appear in histories and does not survive except in the rare fragments that make it into legal records or household accounts, the English of people talking to each other about things that matter to them, the ordinary exchanges of a community at the end of its day. I cannot give you the exact words, nobody wrote them down, but I can give you the quality of them, the specific register of late evening conversation in a communal space when the formal part of the day is over and the people left awake are the ones who are genuinely comfortable with each other. Not performance, not hierarchy, just people talking, the domestic intimacy of people who have spent the day together and have one more hour before sleep and are spending it in the particular mode of conversation that is neither entertaining nor informative, but simply present, simply the verbal expression of being together in the warmth before the night. This quality of conversation, the talking for the sake of talking, the conversation that does not go anywhere and does not need to, is one of the most undervalued pleasures of communal domestic life. It is what happens after supper when nobody has anywhere to be. It is the conversation that happens in the kitchen while the washing up is being done, or on the porch in the late evening before the household retires, or in the minutes before sleep when the day's urgency has finally released its grip and what remains is just the company, just the warmth, just the sound of the people you know saying things that are not particularly important, and that is the point of them. The voices in the hall tonight are doing this. The words are in a language we would not quite understand. The rhythms and the cadences are different from ours. The specific content, the reference points and the shared knowledge, and the particular jokes and allusions that make sense to this specific group of people who have been living together since autumn, is entirely inaccessible to us. But the quality, the specific quality of that late evening, end of day, you and me in the warmth conversation that is not inaccessible. That quality is the same in this hall in November as it is in every warm room where people who know each other are talking quietly at the end of a long day. It is the sound of people being home. In a few weeks, it will be Christmas. The hall knows this, or the people in the hall know this, which amounts to the same thing. The preparations for the feast have already begun in a quiet way. The stocking of the cellar with extra wine, the preservation of the last of the autumn fruit into the sweetmeats that will appear on the Christmas table, the communication with neighbouring households about the visiting and feasting that the season demands. Christmas in a great hall was the year's climax, the moment when everything the hall could do it did at its maximum intensity. But that is weeks away. Tonight is November, the long middle of the year's dark descent, the months between the reckoning of Michaelmas and the celebration of Christmas that are the quiet heart of winter, the time when the harvest is safely stored and the next growing season is months away, and the world has given up its pretense of activity and settled into the long rest that cold and short days impose. There is a quality to November that I think medieval people understood more directly than we do, because they were more exposed to it. November is the month of the dead, the month of All Souls' Day on November 2nd, when medieval Christianity specifically remembered its dead and prayed for their souls in purgatory. The relationship between November and death was not merely liturgical, it was phenomenological. November is the month when the last of the natural world's colour has been extinguished, when the trees are stripped and the fields are empty, and the sky is the particular grey that manages to be simultaneously overcast and bright, a colourless brightness that gives everything. It falls on a slightly flattened, slightly drained quality. November is the month that looks like what it is, the world preparing for the deepest cold. In the medieval understanding, this was not merely seasonal but cyclical in a deeper sense. The year mirroring the lifespan, the spring of birth and the summer of growth, and the autumn of harvest and the winter of death, the year a continuous lesson in the Christian understanding of mortality and renewal. The winter that preceded Christmas was the darkness before the light, the waiting that preceded the joy, the specific quality of November patience that the Christian calendar structured into its deepest meaning. The people in this hall were not unaware of this. The November evenings, with their early darkness and their cold and their particular quality of interior life, were not experienced as mere inconvenience. They were experienced as a season with its own meaning, its own demand on the interior life, its own specific gifts. The long evenings by the fire, the condensed community of the hall, the particular pleasure of being warm inside while the cold pressed against the walls, the songs and the stories and the conversations that November's closed-in quality made possible, that the expansive summer days with their work in the fields and their outdoor celebrations did not permit. Winter was not only something to survive, it was also something to inhabit, to experience for what it specifically was, to find in its constraints and its cold and its darkness, the particular pleasures that only those constraints and that cold and that darkness made possible. The warmth of the fire was warm because the cold was real. The community of the hall was intimate because the cold required intimacy. The stories told in the long evenings had their particular quality because the long evenings existed, because the summer's expansiveness had given way to the winter's concentration, because there was nowhere else to be and nothing else pressing, and the fire was burning and the company was willing and the night was long and there was time for everything. This is the gift that winter gives, not despite its difficulty but through it, not around its cold and its darkness but by way of them, the specific pleasure of warmth that is warmth because of the cold, the specific pleasure of light that is light because of the dark, the specific pleasure of company that is company because the cold has gathered everyone inside. The hall is the instrument through which this gift is delivered. The hall takes the cold and the dark and the years turning toward its deepest point, and makes of them a space that is warm and lit and full of other people, and alive with the particular quality of communal life that winter concentrated and summer dispersed. The hall is winter's best answer to winter. And tonight, on this November evening, with the fire banked and the hall settling towards sleep and the long night ahead of the sleeping household, and the cold outside doing its patient work and the stars overhead in the clear winter sky, and the owl in the wood and the dogs at the hearth, the hall is doing this. It is doing what it was built to do, and what it has been doing every winter of its existence. It is holding the warmth. It is holding the people. It is holding the night at the thickness of its walls, at the insulating depth of its stone, at the specific distance from the fire that varies from comfortable to cold, and that everyone in the hall has calibrated to their own body's need. The hall holds. The fire holds. The night passes. The morning comes. This is the story that winter tells, every winter, in every hall that has ever been built to hold it. The cold outside and the warmth inside, the dark outside and the fire inside, the long night and the sure morning, the death of the old year and the birth of the new one. The ember at the heart of the banked fire is the story in its most concentrated form, small and quiet and almost invisible under its blanket of ash, but alive, still producing heat, still capable of becoming flame again when the morning's breath and the morning's fuel reach it, still here, after the longest hours of the dark, still here at the moment when morning comes and the ash is moved back and the air reaches it, and the fire comes back. The fire comes back. It always comes back. This is what we have been sitting with all evening. Not just the fire as a fact, a chemical process, a practical utility for warmth and cooking. The fire as a meaning. The fire as the thing that survives the night and gives the morning its warmth. The fire as the centre that everything else in the hall organises around, not just physically, not just as a matter of proximity and temperature, but in the deeper sense of what a centre is. The thing that holds. The thing that draws everything toward it. The thing that, when it is present, makes a space into a place. Every hall that ever existed was organised around its fire. Every house before the central heating age. Every camp before the hotel age. Every human gathering before the age of controlled temperature, which means most of human history, arranged itself around the fire in the centre, arranged its sleeping and its eating and its gathering and its talking and its storytelling and its singing and its praying around the fire, because the fire was warm and everything else was cold, and because the fire was alive and the presence of something alive at the centre of a human gathering is not incidental but necessary. You are lying in warmth right now. Your warmth is produced by different means than the warmth in this hall, but it is warmth of the same kind. The warmth of being enclosed, of being inside, of having the cold kept at a distance by walls and blankets, and the basic physics of insulation. The warmth your body produces, and that the blanket holds around you, is the same warmth that the bodies in this hall produce, and that the fire supplements, and that the banked coal maintains through the night. You are warm for the same reason, because you are alive and your body makes warmth and the thing around you holds it. The fire in the medieval hall is not metaphor, but it is not only chemistry either, it is the centre that holds. And in the long human history of needing a centre that holds, needing something warm and alive at the heart of the space we gather in, needing to know that the ember will survive the night and the morning will be warm, the fire in the hall is one of the oldest and most continuous answers we have ever given. The answer is here. The fire is here, the warmth is here, the morning is coming. You are warm. You are here. The night is passing. Sleep. I want to come back to the smell. I began with it, and I find myself wanting to return to it, because the smell of a medieval great hall is one of those sensory details that the historical imagination consistently underestimates. Not because it is too unpleasant to acknowledge, though parts of it are, but because smell is the sense we have the least practice imagining, and because the specific smell of this hall, in its full complexity, is actually one of the most evocative things about it. We have covered the smoke and the rushes and the dogs, but there is more, and I want to give you the full composition. Because the full composition is not unpleasant, it is layered and complex and rich in the way that all environments with multiple simultaneous contributing sources are layered and complex and rich. The tallow from the candles that burned earlier in the evening. The specific smell of tallow as it burns is not the clean sweet smell of beeswax. It is earthier, heavier, with an animal quality that is present but not dominant. The smell of rendered fat doing what rendered fat does when it's set on fire, which is to produce light and heat and a distinctive smell that medieval people associated so automatically with artificial light that they presumably did not notice it as a specific odour at all, any more than we notice the smell of the plastics and metals of our own light sources. The ale. A great hall in winter always has the ghost of ale in its atmosphere. The slightly yeasty, slightly sweet, slightly acidic smell of ale that has been poured and drunk and spilled over the course of an evening, and that lingers in the wood of the tables and in the rushes of the floor long after the cups have been put away. This is not an unpleasant smell. It is the smell of hospitality, of the hall in its working state, of the evening just completed. The wool. The people sleeping in this hall are wrapped in wool. Wool blankets, wool clothing, wool stockings, the specific smell of wool that has been worn all day and is now being warmed by the body it covers. Warm wool has a smell that is entirely its own, different from the smell of clean wool and different from the smell of cold, wet wool. It is the smell of an animal material being gently warmed, the lanolin releasing very slightly into the air, a smell that is earthy and intimate and, for people who grew up with it, deeply associated with the specific comfort of being wrapped in warmth. The bread. The morning's bread is long since eaten, but the bakehouse is adjacent to the hall, and the smell of bread baking, which happened before dawn and continued through the morning, has left its ghost in the air of the hall. Bread baking is one of those smells that the human brain associates with safety and warmth and provision, One of those smells that produces a response in the nervous system before the conscious mind has had time to identify what the smell is. It is the smell of being fed. The human brain seems to find this reassuring in ways that go beyond the rational. The herbs, the strewing herbs in the floor rushes, even after months of feet walking over them, are still faintly present. Not the bright sharp green of meadowsweet at its peak, but something fainter and more complex. The dried down version of the summer's fragrance, the smell of herbs that have been giving their volatile oils to the air slowly since October and have not run out yet. Pennyroyal, meadowsweet, the ghost of lavender. These smells do not dominate. They are the base note under the smoke and the rushes and the dogs, the faintest layer of the composition, the one that requires the most stillness to notice. And underneath all of it, the smell of the stone itself, not stone in the abstract, but this specific stone, this specific English limestone from a specific quarry, which has been absorbing the hall's atmosphere for generations. The smell of old stone is one of those smells that is very difficult to describe because it is the smell of time itself, of accumulated experience, of the slow geological processes that made the stone, and the faster human processes that cut and placed and mortared it, and then lived inside it for 200 years. It is a cool smell, a mineral smell, a smell that is present most strongly when the stone is cold, when the winter has brought the temperature of the walls down, and the cold air at the surface of the stone carries the stone's particular mineral identity outward into the room. All of this together, smoke and rushes and dogs and tallow and ale and wool and bread and herbs and cold stone, this is the smell of the hall. This is the smell of being inside on a winter night in the medieval period, the smell of being sheltered, the smell of the specific warmth that the hall provides. I find, when I try to imagine this smell in its full composition, that it is not unpleasant, it is complex, it is layered, it is alive in a way that no modern domestic environment smells alive, because every one of its components is organic and biological and in motion, contributing its volatile molecules to the air continuously, the smoke and the ale and the wool and the herbs all slowly dispersing into the air they share. The modern domestic smell, by comparison, is remarkably sparse. The smell of a contemporary living space is primarily the smell of its absence, the smell of surfaces that have been cleaned until they do not smell of anything, of materials that are inert and non-biological, of the controlled neutrality that modern domestic management aspires to. This is not without value. The smells that the modern world has removed from domestic environments include many that were genuinely harmful, the smell of contaminated water and poorly preserved food, and the specific diseases that accompanied both. The removal of those smells was the removal of the sources of those smells, which was a genuine improvement in the conditions of human life. But something has gone with them. The complexity of the organic domestic atmosphere, the presence of multiple simultaneous biological processes contributing to the air of a shared space, the specific richness of a room that smells of fire and bread and people and animals and herbs, this was not only a health risk, it was also an environment. A sensory environment that told the people living in it, through the oldest and most direct sense available, what was in the room with them, what had been happening in it, what the conditions of shelter and provision were. The smell of a medieval great hall told you, in the most direct possible terms, that the fire was burning, and the ale had been poured, and the bread had been baked, and the dogs were present, and the people around you were warm and wrapped in wool, and the herbs in the floor had been cut in summer when the world was green. It told you all of this without words, before thought, in the immediate way that smell works, reaching the limbic system before the cortex, producing an emotional response before an intellectual one. The emotional response to the smell of that hall for the people who lived in it was probably something in the vicinity of home. I've been talking about the fire all evening, and I want to spend a little time on the words for fire because language is one of the places where the depth of a human relationship with something can be read, and the English language's relationship with fire is very deep indeed. The word fire itself comes from the Old English fire, which came from the Proto-Germanic fua, which came from the Proto-Indo-European peor, the root that also produced the Greek pia, which is where we get pyromaniac and pyre and pyrotechnics. The same root produced the Latin focus, the hearth, which gives us focus and focal point, and the French feu, fire, which is in every French word that involves burning. The same root, going further back, produced the Sanskrit pawaka, fire, and the Greek fire god's name Prometheus, Piermeth, the one who stole fire. All of these words in all of these languages, from Proto-Indo-European through every branch of the Indo-European language family that spread across Europe and into India over thousands of years, go back to the same root, the same word for the thing that burns and warms and cooks and clears and destroys and creates, and has been the central material fact of human civilization from the moment our ancestors first figured out how to maintain a flame through the night. The word hearth comes from the Old English hearth, related to the Old Norse and Old German equivalents, and it is one of those words whose emotional weight in English exceeds its literal meaning. The hearth is not merely the fire platform. In English, the hearth is the home itself, the home in its most essential and intimate sense. Hearth and home. The hearth as the physical centre of the domestic space, and the home as the emotional centre of the personal world. These two concepts have been fused in English for as long as English has existed, and the fusion tells you something about how deeply the fire at the centre of the dwelling has been associated with the experience of being at home. The word focus, as I mentioned in relation to Latin, meant hearth. When we say that something is the focus of our attention, we are using a word that originally meant the fire. The fire is what attention gathers around. The fire is where focus lives. The medieval hall organised its entire physical and social reality around the fire, and the Latin word for the fire became the word for the centre of attention, and that word is still with us, still in daily use in every field of human activity from physics to psychology to project management, still carrying in its etymology the memory of the fire at the centre of the room around which everything else organised. The word companion comes from the Latin com, together, and panis, bread. A companion is someone you share bread with. The sharing of bread at the same table, the specific act of eating together, is the root of the word for the most valued human relationship outside the family, and the bread that companions shared was baked at the fire. The fire made the bread possible. The fire made the companions possible. The word focus, the word companion, the word lord from loaf guardian, the word lady from loaf maker, the word salary from salt, the word curfew from cover the fire, the word noon from the monks who were too hungry to wait until the 9th hour, the word upper crust from the best part of the loaf. The medieval hall, and the fire at its centre, and the food and salt and bread and company that it produced and contained, is present in the English language in ways that are so thoroughly woven into the fabric of the vocabulary that most of the people who use these words every day have no idea that they are reaching back across 600 years to a stone hall in a winter night in England, to a fire burning in the centre of a room full of people and dogs, to the specific warmth and community and provision and hierarchy of a world that has been gone for centuries, but that is still speaking, still present, still warm in the words we use. Every word you use for the centre of something, every word you use for the company you keep, every word you use for the shelter you are in. These words were made in a world where the fire was at the centre of everything, where the company was the people you ate with, where the shelter was the hall that held the fire and the people together against the cold. The words remember even when we do not. There is something I want to give you before the night ends completely, which is some sense of how long the Great Hall tradition actually ran in English history, because the hall we have been inhabiting tonight is not an isolated moment. It is the middle of an extraordinary continuity that reaches back much further than the medieval period and forward much further than it. The Great Hall as the central communal space of a wealthy or powerful household is one of the oldest forms of human domestic organisation in the northern world. The mead halls of the Anglo-Saxons, described in Beowulf and in the other surviving Old English literature, are recognisable ancestors of the hall we have been sitting in. The great hall of Heorot in Beowulf, bright with light, and warm with fire and full of warriors drinking mead, and the sound of a minstrel's harp, attacked in the darkness by the monster Grendel who cannot stand the warmth and the light and the human community within, is the same form of space, the same logic, the same fire at the centre, and the cold outside, and the community gathered within. Beowulf was probably composed in the 7th or 8th century. The hall at its centre is far older. The Viking longhouses that archaeological work has uncovered across Scandinavia and Iceland, and the islands of Scotland and the British Isles, were organised around the same principle. The long space with the fire along its centre, and the people and animals arranged around it. The high seat for the chief at one end and the lower seating for the household spreading down the length of the building. The Icelandic sagas, composed in the 12th and 13th centuries but describing a society of the 9th and 10th, are full of hall life, full of the specific social dynamics of a community organised around a shared fire, the formal seating at the feasts, the exchange of gifts, the stories told in the long evenings, the enemies who enter the hall and are bound by the laws of hospitality to refrain from violence while the hall's protection holds. The hall is sanctuary, the fire as the token of that sanctuary. And before the Norse halls, the Iron Age roundhouses of Britain, excavated by archaeologists who have found hearth after hearth after hearth, at the centre of the dwelling, surrounded by the evidence of the domestic life organised around it, cooking vessels and storage pots and the bones of animals eaten by the fire's light. The fire at the centre, always the fire at the centre, back and back and back into the deep history of human settlement in these islands. The hall tradition did not end with the medieval period. The great country houses of the 16th and 17th centuries, increasingly elaborate in their architecture and their social pretension, retained the great hall as the formal entrance space and the organising centre of the house's plan, even as the actual communal sleeping and eating that had defined the medieval hall's function moved increasingly to private dining rooms and private bedchambers. The hall became, in these later houses, more ceremonial than functional, a statement of the house's lineage and ambition rather than the practical centre of its daily life. But it remained. The memory of the hall as the heart of the house was too deep to discard entirely. Even in the modern world, the hall persists, not the great communal sleeping and eating space of the medieval period, but the entrance hall, the space just inside the door, the transitional zone between outside and inside, between public and private, between the world and the home. The entrance hall of any substantial house is a remnant of the medieval Great Hall, reduced and transformed but still carrying the same basic function, marking the boundary between the external world and the domestic space, expressing through its scale and decoration the identity and ambition of the household, providing the first experience of the house's character to anyone who enters it. And the fireplace. In virtually every house built in Britain from the medieval period through the 20th century, the fireplace was the architectural centre of the principal room, the element around which furniture was arranged and toward which people oriented themselves. The central hearth became the wall hearth and the chimney, losing efficiency of radiation but gaining the removal of smoke from the room, and the wall fireplace became the organising principle of the domestic interior in the same way that the central hearth had been its predecessor. The mantelpiece, the overmantel, the fender and the fire irons, the furniture of the fireplace, these became the focal point, and we can see in that specific word the memory I traced earlier: focus, hearth, fire, centre of attention. The fire at the centre of the room is perhaps the single most persistent element in the history of domestic architecture in the northern world. For as long as people have been building spaces to live in cold climates, they have been building those spaces around fire. The forms change, the materials change, the technology changes, but the logic is constant. The cold outside, the warmth inside, the fire that makes the inside warm, the community that gathers around the fire, the particular quality of human life that fire and community together produce. You're at the end of that tradition right now if you're lying in a heated house on a winter night. If there is warmth in the room you're in that was produced by some form of combustion, if the walls around you are keeping the cold outside. The technology is different. The warmth is more reliable and more precisely controlled and more safely delivered than anything available to the people in the hall, but you are in the same relationship to it. Inside, warm, the cold held at the thickness of the wall, the night passing around you while you rest. The tradition is long. The fire is at its centre. The fire has always been at its centre. And the morning is still coming. This is the last of the night. This is the deepest quiet, the hour just before the light begins, the hour when the winter dark is at its most complete, and the world outside the hall is at its coldest and most still. In the hall, nothing moves. The dogs do not dream. The fire makes no sound. The tapestries are still. The carved angels in the roof are watching through darkness so complete that they themselves cannot be seen, watching with stone eyes that have watched every night of this hall's existence and will watch every night that comes after. The people sleeping in the rushes are as still as the people sleeping in the churchyard beyond the village wall. There is a quality to deep sleep that is close to the quality of other kinds of stillness, and in the dark at this hour the distinction between the sleep that will end when morning comes and the sleep that does not end is not visible from outside. They are all still. They are all breathing. They are all warm, some more than others, some barely but still. The fire is at its absolute minimum. The coal under the ash is the smallest version of itself, the ember reduced to its most essential nucleus, the barely living thing that is still alive because the ash is deep enough and the cold has not reached it. It is giving very little heat now. It is giving almost no light, but it is there. It is the fact of the night. The fire is still there. I want to leave you here for a moment, in this deepest part of the night, in this maximum stillness, in this last moment before the world begins again. Not because the night is sad, not because the darkness is threatening, but because this is the moment the night has been building toward, the moment that all the evening's warmth and community and story and song were preparation for, the moment of complete rest, the moment when everything that was moving has stopped and everything that was sounding has gone quiet, and the only thing in the hall that is still doing anything at all is the coal under the ash, barely alive, keeping the fire for the morning. This is what survives the night, the ember, the warmth, the sleeping people, the still dogs, the carved angels watching. The morning is going to come, it is already on its way. The darkness is already at its latest possible point, the furthest from dawn that it gets, and from here it will begin to recede, not quickly, not visibly yet, but begun. The journey back toward light has started. But right now is still the dark. Right now is the ember. Right now is the quiet. You are warm. The hall holds. The fire holds. Sleep. There is a particular quality to the stories we tell about the past, especially the deep past, the past that none of us have any personal connection to, the past that exists only in documents and archaeology, and the buildings that survive and the words that have been preserved and the long, slow work of historians who have spent their lives learning to read the evidence of lives that did not know they were being read. The quality I am thinking about is the quality of approach. When we approach the medieval hall, when we try to imagine ourselves into it, we are doing something that requires us to acknowledge a fundamental gap between what we know and what we do not know, and then to cross that gap, not by pretending it does not exist, but by finding the points where it is narrowest, the places where the material reality of the past is specific enough and concrete enough that the imagination can find its footing. The fire is one of those points. The fire is one of the places where the gap between the medieval world and our own is narrowest, not because the technology is the same, but because the fundamental experience is the same. The warmth of a living fire on a cold night, the movement of the flame, the quality of the light, the sound of wood burning, the specific sensation of being close to a heat source that is alive in a way that other heat sources are not. This is not metaphor. The fire was chemically alive in the medieval hall, and it is chemically alive in any fireplace or campfire you have ever sat beside. The living quality of fire is not a cultural construct. It is physics and chemistry, expressing themselves in ways that the human nervous system has been responding to for a very long time. The rushes and the smoke and the dogs and the ale and the wool and the cold stone are also points of contact, places where the physical reality of the hall is concrete enough to be felt rather than merely understood. You know what cold stone feels like. You know what dogs smell like when they are warm and sleeping. You know what wool feels like against your skin. You know what fire sounds like. You know what darkness feels like when it is genuine darkness, not the diluted darkness of an electrified world, but the actual absence of a light, or at least you know it well enough to imagine it. What you do not know, what none of us can know, is what it felt like from the inside to be a specific person in that hall, to be the steward with his accounts and his responsibility, and his careful banking of the fire, or the kitchen worker near the wall with her cold feet and her tired back, and her thoughts about her sister 2 days' ride away, or the squire with his future waiting for him like a door not yet opened. We do not know their inner lives. History did not record them. The records that survive give us the surfaces, the quantities and the prices and the organizational structures and the rules and the procedures, but not the texture of the experience from within. This is the limitation of historical knowledge, and it is also, I think, one of its gifts. Because the gap between what we know and what we can only imagine is the gap into which the imagination moves, and what the imagination finds there is not what was there, not exactly, not in its specificity, but something related to it, something that honours the reality of those lives without pretending to have access to it that we do not have. What I find in that gap when I try to enter it is warmth. The specific warmth of the hall, the warmth that was not given and not guaranteed but made daily by the labour of specific people who woke before dawn to tend fires and carried water and split wood and baked bread and bank the coals at the end of the night before lying down on their pallets in the warmth they had made, the warmth that was the product of that labour and that community and that long accumulated knowledge of what fire requires and what winter takes and what a hall can provide. The warmth is still here, in some sense, not the specific warmth of that specific hall, not the heat produced by those specific coals on that specific night, but the warmth in the tradition, the warmth in the knowledge that has passed from generation to generation of fire tenders and hall keepers and winter survivors, the warmth in the language that still carries the memory of the fire at the centre of the home, the warmth in the human instinct, still present after all the centuries of central heating and double glazing, to gather around a fire and find it good. You're in that tradition tonight. The hall you're lying in is different in its technology and its materials and its degree of comfort from the hall we have been visiting all evening, but the basic arrangement is the same. You, inside, warm, the cold outside the walls, the night passing around you while you rest. The technology that provides your warmth is different. The physics that provides it are the same. You're warm because something is burning somewhere to make the heat that keeps the cold out, and you're resting in the product of that burning the way the steward rested in the product of the banked coal, and the morning will come for you the way it came for him, grey and gradual and already beginning its long, slow project of lighting the world. This is not a small thing. This is the most basic human experience of home. Warm inside, cold outside, night passing, morning coming. It has been this for as long as there have been winters and walls and fires. It will be this for every winter that comes after this one. You are in the long tradition of the warm inside on the winter night. You are in the hall. The fire is still there. Let me talk to you about what cold gives. This is something that seems paradoxical, and it is something that I think the medieval world understood more directly than we do, because the cold was more present in their lives, and its removal was not available at the touch of a thermostat. The cold gave specific things that the warmth alone could not give, and I want to try to name some of them. The cold made the warmth feel like warmth. This is the most basic and in some ways the most profound of the gifts, the way that contrast sharpens experience. The warmth of the fire in the hall on a February night when the walls are cold enough to condensate, and the floor in the far corner is near freezing, is not the same experience as warmth in a room that is uniformly, automatically, precisely controlled to 68 degrees Fahrenheit by a thermostat. The warmth of the hall is felt specifically and vividly as warmth, as the opposite of what is immediately outside the walls, as the product of specific labour and specific fuel and specific skill. The person who has just come in from the cold, who has crossed the yard in the frost and is now standing with their face toward the fire, is experiencing warmth in its full specificity. Warmth as a gift, warmth as relief, warmth as the particular pleasure of the body receiving what it needed. The cold made the community feel like community. The people gathered in this hall in winter are gathered in part by the cold itself. In summer the community disperses. People are outdoors in the fields and gardens, doing their separate work, the expansive summer making individual activity possible. The winter closes that possibility, draws everyone back inside, back to the shared fire, back to the communal space. The community of the hall in winter is partly an enforced community, a gathering produced by the cold's exclusion of other options. But an enforced community is still a community. The warmth of the fire that requires everyone to be near it means everyone is near each other. The conversation that happens in the evening hall, because there is nowhere else to be, is still conversation. The songs that fill the long evenings, because the long evenings need to be filled, are still songs. The community that the cold enforces has the same properties as any community. Shared space, shared warmth, shared provision, shared time, the specific texture of daily life with specific other people that becomes, over months of winter, something that is not merely forced proximity but genuine knowing, genuine connection. The cold made the stories feel like stories. There is a reason that storytelling traditions around the world are predominantly winter traditions, that the great narrative poems and epics and fairy tales and myths were told in the long dark evenings by the fire while the cold pressed against the walls and the night went on outside. The winter evening is the natural habitat of the story. The conditions that produce the story are the conditions the cold creates. People gathered inside in the warmth, with time, with nowhere to go, with the particular receptivity of bodies that have worked hard all day and are now resting, with the fire casting its moving light that makes the interior of the room seem larger and the world outside seem further away, and the story being told seem more present and more real. The cold made the bread taste like bread. The specific pleasure of a hot loaf of bread in a cold kitchen, the way the warmth of it registers in the hands before it registers in the mouth, the way the smell of fresh bread in a cold room is more present and more arresting than the same smell in a warm one, these are functions of the cold. The contrast that the cold provides against the warmth of the food enhances the experience of the food itself. The people who ate in this hall in winter ate with a different quality of attention than we bring to eating in our temperature-controlled rooms. Not a better quality, necessarily, not more sophisticated, but more immediate, more physical, more grounded in the specific sensation of warmth entering a body that needed it. I do not want to make the cold sound better than it was. The cold in a medieval English winter was genuinely dangerous in ways that our warm houses and our adequate food supply and our reliable fuel sources have made it, for most people in developed countries, no longer dangerous. The cold killed people. The cold caused suffering. The cold was one of the primary engines of the poverty and vulnerability that characterized the lives of the medieval poor, for whom the calculation between fuel and food and clothing and shelter was a real and sometimes fatal one. But I do want to suggest that the experience of the cold, for the people who survived it, was not only a negative experience, it was also a teacher. It taught the specific value of warmth by providing its specific absence. It taught the specific value of community by making the solitary cold too harsh to sustain. It taught the specific value of skill, the skill of the fire tender and the food preserver and the woodcutter and the builder, by making the consequences of their absence vivid and immediate. The medieval hall was built by people who understood the cold in this way, who built against it with full awareness of what they were building against, who understood that the warmth they were constructing was warmth in relation to a cold that was real and present and had to be respected. The specific weight of the walls, the specific depth of the insulation, the specific position of the central hearth, all of these design choices were made in direct response to the cold, in the knowledge of what happened when the cold was not adequately addressed. The hall is the human answer to the cold, not the elimination of the cold, which was not possible, but the creation of a space within the cold that holds warmth, that takes the resources of wood and stone and skill and community, and turns them into a livable interior. The hall says, we cannot stop the winter, but we can make a place inside it. We cannot stop the night, but we can make a fire that lasts through it. We cannot stop the cold, but we can gather together and share what warmth we have and carry each other through until the morning. This is the human answer to the cold. It has been this for every winter that has ever been. The cold is outside. The warmth is here. The fire is still there. Sleep. This is nearly the end of our time here together, and I find myself wanting to do what the hall itself does at this hour, which is to settle, to let the evening's richness simply be present without adding to it, to let the fire that has been burning all night continue at its own pace without asking it to do more. We have been in this hall for the length of an evening and a night. We have smelled the smoke and the rushes and the ale and the wool. We have heard the minstrel and the riddles and the songs and the quiet late evening conversation. We have watched the fire from its working height through its long, slow descent to the banked ember. We have heard the owl in the winter wood. We have been in the hall in its deepest winter quiet, when the sleeping bodies were still, and the fire was at its minimum, and the cold outside was at its maximum, and the night was at its furthest from morning. We have been with the people of the hall, the steward and the squire and the pages and the kitchen workers, people whose names we do not know and whose inner lives we cannot access, but whose physical circumstances we have been imagining with some specificity, whose cold and whose warmth and whose exhaustion and whose rest we have been trying to feel. We have been with the dogs who understood their working hours, and the hawk whose wildness was contained but not diminished, and the carved angels in the roof watching everything from the darkness. We have talked about the fire in its physical reality, its chemistry and its ecology, and its specific requirements of fuel and air and skill. We have talked about the fire in its language, the words that carry the memory of fire in their etymology, focus and hearth, and companion, and lord, and curfew. We have talked about the fire in its history, the long tradition of the hall with the fire at its centre, reaching back through this medieval period to the Anglo-Saxon mead hall and the Viking longhouse and the Iron Age roundhouse, and into the deep past of human settlement in cold climates. We have talked about what the cold gives and what the warmth means and what the community of the hall provides that the isolated warm room does not. We have talked about the people who built the hall and the people who maintain it, and the people who sleep in it, and the long invisible labour that produces the warmth that the sleeping bodies are receiving without thinking about it. All of this, in the end, comes back to the ember, the coal at the heart of the banked fire still alive in the grey ash, still producing the minimum heat required to survive until morning, the fire in its most reduced and most essential form, the fire as pure persistence, the fire as the decision to still be here when the morning comes. There is something in this that I want to offer you as the last thing, not as a lesson, and not as a moral, but as a simple observation that I find genuinely beautiful when I sit with it. The ember does not know it is being kept. The fire does not understand that someone went to the trouble of banking it carefully so that it would survive. The coal has no awareness of the morning that it is being preserved for. It simply burns at whatever rate the conditions permit, with whatever intensity the oxygen and the fuel and the temperature allow. It does not hold on. It does not try to survive. It simply is what it is, doing what fire does, as long as the conditions for doing it exist. The care is entirely on the human side. The decision that the morning matters, the labour of the banking, the specific skill of getting the ash depth exactly right, the knowledge that the ember needs to be protected but not smothered, all of this is the human contribution to the fire's survival. The fire does not save itself. It is saved by the people who understand what it needs and provide it. This seems to me to be one of the most beautiful and most fundamental things about the human relationship with fire, which is that it requires ongoing care, ongoing attention, ongoing labour to keep alive. The fire does not persist without the person. The warmth does not continue without the effort. The morning is not warm without the person who, in the cold of the previous evening, made the decision that it should be and did the specific physical work to make it so. The steward banking the fire before he sleeps is making a promise to the people who will wake in the morning. He does not think of it in those terms. He is simply doing his job, doing what he does every night, making the responsible decision at the end of the day to prepare for the beginning of the next. But the effect of his decision is that the morning will be warm, and the warmth of the morning is, in the most literal sense, a gift from the evening before, the product of someone's care carried across the dark hours and delivered when it is needed. I think about this when I think about the things we do at the end of the day to prepare for the day that follows. The ordinary domestic acts of care that constitute the evening in a household, the preparations made, the things put away, the arrangements for tomorrow. None of these are dramatic. None of them are heroic. But they carry across the night and arrive in the morning as the conditions of a day that is ready to begin, and the people who receive them, the people who wake in the morning to find that the preparations have been made, are receiving the care of the previous evening without necessarily knowing it. The fire is still there because someone cared that it would be. The morning will be warm because someone banked the coal. The hall is still the hall because someone built it and someone maintains it, and someone wakes before dawn every morning to get it ready for the day. This is not a small thing. This is, in its way, everything. The warmth is here. The morning is coming. Sleep now. Let the fire keep watch. The ember is alive. The morning will be warm. There is a particular quality to the last hour before sleep that I want to sit in with you for just a little longer. Not the approaching sleep itself, but the hour before it. The specific texture of consciousness in the final minutes of the waking day, when the body has released most of its urgency, and the mind is moving at the pace of the fire, slow and warm and not quite purposeful. You know this hour. You're probably in it right now. The particular quality of thoughts that come at the end of the day, when the day's demands have finally receded, and what remains is the mind in its resting state, Not thinking exactly, not sleeping yet, but somewhere in between. Images from the day, fragments of conversation, the specific sensory memories that the day has deposited, moving through the mind at their own pace, not demanded, not directed, just present and then gone and replaced by others. The people in this hall, in their last hour of waking, have thoughts like these. The specific thoughts are not accessible to us, but the quality of them, the quality of end-of-day mental life, is the same quality that you are probably experiencing right now. The loosening of the day's grip, the images and fragments floating free, the body beginning its slow withdrawal from the day's engagement, calling its attention inward, preparing for the long interior work of sleep. The fire knows nothing of this. The fire is still doing what fire does, consuming fuel, producing heat and light, existing entirely in the present tense, without any interior experience of the day ending or the night beginning. The fire has no yesterday and no tomorrow. It has only the conditions of this moment. The fuel available, the oxygen available, the temperature of the air, the specific qualities of this particular coal and this particular ash and this particular draft from this particular gap in the wall. Everything the fire knows, it knows right now. There is something in this that the mind in its last waking hour can find if it is looking for it. The fire's quality of complete presence, its existence entirely in the now of its burning, is a state that the human mind can approach but rarely achieve. The state of being entirely here, without the past trailing its associations into the present moment, and without the future casting its demands ahead. The fire is entirely here. It has no memories and no plans. It burns. The people in the hall are not able to be the fire. They have memories and plans and all the weight of a specific human life, with its specific relationships and its specific obligations and its specific fears and its specific joys. But they can sit near the fire, and in sitting near it they can find, in some approximation of the fire's present tense completeness, a moment of being here without the there of yesterday or tomorrow. A moment of the hall and the warmth and the quiet and the low ember and nothing else. This is what the fire gives at the end of the day, not just warmth for the body, which is what it gives all day, but warmth for the mind, a quality of presence that the fire produces in the people who sit near it, the specific quality of attention that firelight generates, the slow-focused watching of something that moves and changes and is alive and requires no particular response, only the willingness to be here and to watch. You have been here all evening. You have been in the hall and by the fire and in the long quiet night, and in the space between first sleep and second sleep, and in the deepest hour before the dawn. You have heard the hall and smelled it and felt it, as much as it is possible to feel a place you have not physically been, through the attention you have given to the details I have been offering you. The details matter, the specific smell of the rushes, the specific sound of the fire at its low working strength, the specific feel of the wool blanket and the straw pallet and the cold stone floor underneath both, the specific quality of the firelight on the carved angels in the roof, the specific weight of the banked coal surviving the night. These specifics are not decoration. They are the thing itself, the texture of the experience, the grain of the world that history gives us when we approach it with enough care and enough attention and enough willingness to let it be real. The hall is real. The fire is real. The people sleeping in the rushes are real, or were real, which is a different kind of real, but not an absent kind. They lived. They were cold in the far corner of the hall and warm near the fire. They ate dark bread and they drank ale and they watched the minstrel and they listened to the riddles and they sang